welcome to the Spring 2014 Conference of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy. My name is John Coatsworth. I'm the Provost of the University, and I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the University, its faculty, students, and staff. And on behalf of President Bollinger and Merritt Jano, who is the Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, the Center's Columbia home, and all of us here at Columbia University, thank you for being with us. 1 year ago, we gathered in this same rotunda to celebrate the launch of this new center. At that time, it was readily apparent why the center just had to be created, and why Columbia is uniquely well suited to be its home. What we could not know as we launched this new enterprise was what an amazing success it would be in such a short time. Now we know. In its inaugural year, the center has quickly become a major focus of the intellectual life of the School of International and Public Affairs and of Columbia. We hoped we could build a world-class, policy-focused research center, one that would help policymakers and the public navigate the complex and rapidly changing world of global energy policy. What we could not know then was just what a great director we had found in Jason Bordoff. Jason, where are you? There he is. To celebrate all that Jason and his colleagues at CEPA and throughout Columbia have accomplished these past 12 months, and the future accomplishments that will undoubtedly follow, Jason and the Center have put together a fantastic program. So thanks again to Jason and to the many Columbia faculty, staff, and students who have worked with him to make this event possible. And thanks to all of you. As I said, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who will be participating in the conference today, and would like to extend an especially warm Columbia welcome to a number of particularly distinguished, and I might add extraordinarily busy public officials and former officials who have joined us today. The first that I want to mention is John Podesta, former Chief of Staff and now Counselor to President Obama. Unfortunately, he's not here to welcome in person because his plane is delayed, but we hope he will be with us shortly. Dan Poneman, Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Energy. Carlos Pascual, the State Department's Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs, and Lord Peter Mandelson, former European Trade Commissioner. These speakers and their colleagues embody a commitment to public service and global leadership that is central to Columbia University. The perspectives and insights they provide across the full range of economic, geopolitical, and environmental issues that relate to energy production and consumption are central to the research and educational mission of our Center on Global Energy Policy. Energy lies at the nexus of many of the world's most urgent and multifaceted policy challenges, and that is exactly why the Center's aim of providing independent, rigorous energy policy analysis is all the more critical and timely today. Columbia University is proud to produce leading academic research across a wide range of disciplines, including energy and environmental policy. We also embrace the opportunity to ensure that the unparalleled contributions of our students and faculty that they make every year are applied in real-world settings, whether homegrown or international in nature. We believe that this conference reflects the unique strengths of Columbia University, of the School of International and Public Affairs, and of our new center, and we hope that it will inspire and foster conversation and ideas on our collective challenge: how to sustainably provide billions of people with reliable, affordable, and secure access to energy. Thank you once again for being here. And now please join me in welcoming Jason Bordoff, the founding director of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy.
Thank you so much, John, Columbia's really extraordinary provost, for joining us here today. And for the really fantastic commitment that you and President Bollinger, CEPA's Dean, Merritt Jano, and the rest of the university's leadership have given to all of us as we've built this new Energy Policy Research Institute. John was the dean of CEPA when I joined the faculty. He was the one who recruited me, in fact, and so I quite literally would not be here today were it not for him. So I just want to thank you for your vision and your leadership in what this center was able to become and is going to become. Many of you joined us in this room just over a year ago today to help us celebrate the launch of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'm really excited to see so many friends back with us today to celebrate our first anniversary and to hear from the really fantastic, distinguished lineup of guest speakers that we have for the afternoon. I'm really very proud of what the Center's been able to achieve in its first year, and let me just quickly recap a few of the highlights. We've become the leading venue in New York for discussions of energy policy issues, holding nearly 50 public events about current energy issues with leaders like the U.S. Energy Secretary, the National Security Advisor, Mayor Bloomberg, and many, many others. We've convened nearly 20 off-the-record roundtables, bringing senior leaders together with energy policy officials and others. Tomorrow, for example, we'll hold a CEO-level roundtable to discuss New York area fuel system resilience in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, which is particularly timely after the federal government just last week announced the new creation of an emergency gasoline reserve to be built partially in New York. And this fulfills part of a request made of the center by the city in its report, A Stronger, More Resilient New York. We've held events like that really around the world in key energy capitals like Beijing and Istanbul and London. In just a few weeks, in fact, we will be convening ministers and other senior leaders like Daniel Yergin, who's here today, to discuss energy access issues and the regional use of East Africa's natural gas resources during the U.S.-Africa Energy Ministerial meeting in Ethiopia. As part of our mission to help train tomorrow's leaders, we've created new programs for students interested in energy. One example is the recently created Women in Energy program that we started that currently brings about 200 students together with female leaders and mentors in the energy sector. We've initiated research projects on a host of timely issues like U.S. energy export policy, global gas trade and pricing, solar deployment and shale gas development in China, Mexican energy reform, among several others. We've created a fellows program that allows senior leaders from the energy sector, from industry or government or elsewhere, to come and spend time researching, writing, teaching, lecturing, interacting with students. I want to acknowledge and thank David Sandalo, the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, who had formerly been one of the top officials at the U.S. Energy Department during President Obama's first term, for his partnership in helping to build the center and for the role he's playing this afternoon in helping to moderate today's events. And we have several non-resident fellows that also spend time during the course of the year here at the center. Many of you have interacted with them, most recently, for example, Adrian Lejeune, the former CEO of Pemex, who was here a few weeks ago discussing Mexican energy reform, teaching students and working with students on that topic. Today, we announced 2 additional non-resident fellows who will be working with the center over the course of the next year. Bob McNally, who was a former top White House energy advisor at the National Security Council and the National Economic Council in the administration of George W. Bush, and I see Bob in the back there, and Bob Holman, a leading environmental lawyer and formerly Governor Cuomo's top energy and environment advisor, who has been playing a key role in putting a lot of the work together, like what we're doing tomorrow on fuel system resilience and New York area fuel issues. We are going to continue to build on this momentum to expand our research and programs to fulfill our mission to improve the quality of energy policy and the quality of energy dialogue through objective, balanced, rigorous analysis and policy-relevant analysis about the rapidly changing energy landscape, both in the U.S. and around the world. I want to thank just a couple of people for helping to make today possible: Jesse McCormick, Ka Wei, Terry Culver, Matt Robinson, and so many other staff and students at Columbia who helped put today's event together. I want to say a word of thanks to Dan Yergin for his participation in several of our conversations this afternoon, and more importantly, for so generously giving his time to help build this new center. Dan's been a mentor for many years, for which I'm really very grateful, and I'm grateful for his deep commitment to this center's success. Finally, I want to thank all of our speakers. Particular thanks to Counsel to President John Podesta, who, as you heard, will be here in a few moments. And those of you who are very observant or have a particular affinity for thick Boston accents will notice that he is not Gina McCarthy, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, despite the pictures of her that are plastered in posters all over campus. Gina was called away on official foreign travel for the administration at the last minute, but really am thrilled, we're very lucky and honored that John Podesta, Counsel to the President, has agreed to speak to us today about the administration's energy and climate agenda, which has been very much in the news this week. Before I introduce our first keynote speaker, let me quickly mention a few housekeeping items. First, please turn off or silence your cell phones. We will have time for Q&A over the course of the day. If you'd like to ask a question, please write it on one of the index cards that you'll find on your chair and hand it to one of the ushers that'll be walking around collecting questions, and we'll have our moderators pose those questions to our speakers. For those of you watching online, you can participate as well. Just tweet your questions to our handle at Columbia U Energy. And use the hashtag CGEP events. Now with that out of the way, I want to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Helge Lund, the President and CEO of Statoil. While we're celebrating our first anniversary today, Helge is celebrating his 10th as CEO of Statoil, having been appointed almost exactly 10 years ago this month. That was just a few years after Statoil became a publicly listed company. And in that time, Statoil has become quite a different company, growing from a national oil company focused on development of Norway's offshore energy resources to a truly global oil and gas company with new finds in Brazil, in Tanzania, in Canada, and elsewhere. Statoil is one of the world's largest oil and gas companies, particularly as an offshore operator. Last year, it was the world's leading oil and gas explorer, measured by conventional discoveries. Statoil is the second largest supplier of natural gas to Europe after Gazprom, so particularly timely to have Helge with us today, given what's been in the news about European energy security. And it's also timely because North American shale revolution features prominently in Statoil's growth strategy, as I'm sure you'll hear, with the company having invested heavily in North American unconventional oil and gas resources in the past several years. And given its history in Norway, its history of state ownership, it also brings a unique perspective to many of the political issues and the public concerns that exist here about how we think about the oil and gas boom that's taking place in the US right now. So I'm very grateful to Helge for traveling from Norway to be with us here today. Really looking forward to his remarks, after which he'll have a conversation on stage with Dan Yergin. Again, if you have questions, write them on cards and we'll pass those to Dan. Please join me in welcoming to Columbia University the CEO of Statoil, Helge Lund.
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, it's very, very inspiring, I think, for all of us to see what you have achieved during the course of the last year, and already established the institution as a credible and very objective and respected voice in the energy debate, not only in the US, but also broader, and we already benefit a lot from what you're doing from the center. Your mission statement talks about how you want to improve the quality of energy policy and energy dialogue through objective, balanced, and also rigorous analysis. And that is something I think we need now more than ever. For Statoil, and I think for the rest of the oil and gas industry, a policy framework supporting a sustainable future for our industry is of great importance. Energy issues, in our view, are more complex and also connected than ever before. As our program here today reflects, energy is front and center in many debates. First, energy policy is economic policy. In his State of the Union speech, President Obama talked about energy as one of the biggest factors in bringing jobs back to America. And at the same time, the International Energy Agency has warned that Europe could lose a third of its global share of energy-intensive export due to high energy prices. These are illustrations of why no politician can avoid having energy policy high on their agenda today. Energy policy is also environmental policy. And 25 years ago, here in New York City, actually, the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland presented the UN-commissioned report, Our Common Future. It established an unbreakable link between energy and development. And it is still recognized for having defined the term sustainable development as meeting the needs of today without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. At the time, this was a thought-provoking concept. Today, no responsible politician can ignore the importance of those words, and it's no longer a thought-provoking concept. Energy policy is also security policy. From the Arab Spring to the tensions currently between Russia and Ukraine, energy is an integrated part of those conflicts. And in Statoil, we just over a year ago experienced the tragedy of a terrorist attack, 40 people being killed, 5 from Statoil, at the gas plant in Amenas in Algeria. And climate change and natural disasters are also now among the non-traditional security challenges with potential to create social unrest and conflicts. On that basis, our view is that security policy is not only a political or a military issue, it's also very definitely also on the corporate agenda. President Lincoln once said that I never had a policy. I have just tried to do my very best each and every day. Today, many are questioning the choices of both the industry and policy makers when it comes to production and consumption of energy. And many quite understandably ask if we are doing our very best each and every day. The mission statement for the Center addresses the need for policymakers for high-quality information to drive concrete and practical solutions to the challenges and opportunities in today's changing energy landscape. And of course, extremely important perspective. I'm going to talk about some of these challenges and opportunities as we see them in Statoil. And I'll try to relate it to some of the issues prominent also in the US energy policy agenda. Each of my topics actually comes in the form of a C. My first C is really for competitiveness. Within our industry, we are all used to competing for capital, for resources, and for talents. What I now say is that the competitiveness of our industry must improve. Why? The last decade, the oil price has almost tripled from around 40 to around $110 per barrel. But due to escalating investments, increased costs, more complexity, and higher risk, return on capital from companies in Statoil's peer group has decreased by a third in the same period. And last year, it was at or below 10% for over half of the companies in the same group of companies. And in a highly risk-based industry, that is not sustainable. We have to absorb resource risks, reservoir risks, market risks, political risks, security risks, And we definitely have to return more than 10% of the capital invested with that perspective. And capital intensity and cost intensity are issues the industry, in my opinion, need to tackle ourselves. We are not asking for political support in this perspective. These are challenges that we must face and meet and solve alone. We need to build balance sheets that are robust in volatile markets, be more disciplined in the way we use capital, introduce more standardization and industrializations that other industries are doing, and work in partnerships as operators and across the supply chain to find more efficient and also smarter ways of working. Either we change our model of value creation to become substantially more efficient in how we use our resources, or we will, as an industry, in my opinion, over the long term, not be competitive in the race for capital and talent, and worse, we can not deliver on our mission of bringing light, heating, and also transportation to the world. My second C is for carbon, or maybe more precisely, for carbon efficiency. As we speak, sustainable energy for all is moving up on the political agenda, and rightly so. 1.3 billion people still lack access to electricity, and the global CO2 level continues climbing to new all-time highs. The latest reports from the UN's climate panel, IPCC, confirms that the climate change is real and that is happening now. The US administration National Climate Assessment that became public this week conclude, to my understanding, in the same direction. Extreme weather is estimated to have cost the American economy alone more than $100 billion in 2012. And globally, we are facing other issues as well, severe health consequences, breakdown of infrastructure, and more conflicts, to name a few. And to avoid a development where the 2-degree scenario is an illusion, we need new policy measures. Now is the time to strongly advocate for incentives that support investments in carbon-efficient solutions. It will, in our opinion, spur innovation and implementation of new technology that reduces CO2 emissions in the most efficient way. In that perspective, I and Statoil, we're strong believers in a high global price on carbon. It would lead to more natural gas replacing coal in the power generation, reducing CO2 emissions by as much as 50%, perhaps more. And I think you have already seen the impact and the effect of this here in the US. But at the same time, cheap coal is now finding its way to Europe, increasing emissions there. Energy markets are global, and so are the impacts of energy decisions. That's why efficient climate policies also need to be global. A higher carbon price would also give incentives for reducing emissions from flaring and methane leakages, another goal of the administration's climate action plan. As a climate gas, methane is 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That means even small cuts can have big impacts. Through leakages and flaring, the oil and gas industry is responsible for roughly 20% of global methane emissions. We need to take responsibility for this. The industry must therefore work together and with regulators to make sure we get the right technology, frameworks, and incentives in place to monitor and also manage these emissions. One example of how we at Statoil are working can be found in the Bakken in North Dakota. You might have seen the satellite images showing the fields there by night. They are fairly well lit up. The many flares still burning. What you see are large emissions, but also great values going up in flames. That is why Statoil is investing in infrastructure and processing capacity. That is why we have laid around 700 miles of pipeline in North Dakota to capture this gas, as well as carry water and produced oil. We work closely with infrastructure providers and processors to assist with future planning. We prioritize the use of leading wellhead technology and techniques to limit the impact of our operations, and we continue to innovate. One example is a project we have put together with GE and a local company called Farbus. Through this partnership, we capture gas that would otherwise have been flared, compress it, and use it as a fuel for drilling rigs. That means that we're cutting emissions both from flaring and also from operations of our drilling rigs. All this is being done in collaboration with the government of North Dakota. They have an effective regulatory regime in place, and the value of the gas produced incentivizes constructing gathering system as quickly as economically and technically feasible. We are really proud of the progress being made, but more is definitely needed. And that takes me to my third and last C, and the C is for communities. Our industry needs access. I mean access for resources, but we also need acceptance. And according to the Wall Street Journal, at least 15 million Americans now live within 1 mile of an oil and gas well. And millions more living along the rail lines that we depend on to transport crude oil from these fields. Two examples of how our industry is entering new and more sensitive areas than we have been used to, with different challenges. When we look at polls saying that 50% of those surveyed oppose the increased use of fracking, we must ask ourselves if we have been able to build trust with the communities we depend on. When questions are not answered, they grow to concerns, and when concerns are not addressed, they escalate to conflicts. That is why my recipe for engaging is linked to transparency. This is really the new currency for trust, being open on what we are doing. Dialogue, we need to engage, and also responsibility, take responsibility for our own operations. People care about what we do because what we do really matters. Our product matters, how they impact society matters, so people should really care. There you have my 3 C's, each a challenge in itself, all complex and connected. To address them, we need technology, innovation, and regulation to work together. The onshore revolution right here in the US is a good example of how innovation can spur the competitiveness of a whole economy, and at the same time reduce CO2 emissions. I see a great future for our industry also in a low carbon economy. The world needs our products. Even in IEA's 2-degree scenario before 2035, we must replace 4 times Saudi Arabia's production of oil today and 10 times Norway's production of gas, just to fight decline, i.e. to keep the production at the level we see today. And how we deal with competitiveness, carbon, and communities can have a significant impact on our planet and our society, and this will help determine whether we are able to secure the long-term legitimacy of our industry. Securing legitimacy requires rising to the society's expectations, or in the words of Lincoln, doing the very best we can each and every day. Thank you for your interest. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helga, for that very thoughtful and insightful remarks, really about the oil and gas industry in, as you put it, a more carbon-efficient world. Maybe we might start by just talking, as Jason described it, Statoil is a Norwegian company, became world famous for what it was doing offshore in the North Sea and elsewhere. How did you end up onshore in North America?
Well, the perspective we have taken is that unconventional resources will be an important part of future energy supply. And this is about understanding the geology. It's about planning projects. It's about being efficient in what we're doing. So these are the strategic perspectives on how we entered. So we have positions now in Marcellus, Eagle Ford, as well as in Bakken in North Dakota, and it's an important part of the strategy of Statoil.
Right. You described how Statoil is focused on reducing methane as part of applying technology. It's been about 6 years now since this unconventional revolution began. Is the business the same as it was 6 years ago? Do we know more how to operate?
I think we know much more. And I think many of us have been surprised how fast the improvements have been developing in terms of efficiency and improvements, and I think that will just continue. But I also think it has signaled, as I said in my speech, that there are issues that we need to solve, and methane is one of them. Well, so, of course, it's very important that we work with the infrastructure so that we flare as little as possible.
You've emphasized methane, and of course, in the last year or so, it's taken on more prominence as an issue. Do we know how much methane is really produced in the drilling process, escapes? I mean, the estimates are quite wide. Is it sufficiently measured?
I do not think we have the full scientific picture yet. That is one of the reasons why Statoil and other companies are working with the University in Texas and others to try to establish the baseline so that we know more in order to be able to also put in place the right actions.
Right. You quoted both President Obama and the International Energy Agency on the much more how the U.S. competitiveness has vis-a-vis Europe. Kind of how does Europe and European industry see the shale gas revolution in North America?
Well, I think it's interesting to observe that the European energy policy, we set out with 3 objectives: to increase security of supply, to improve efficiency in the energy supply, and also reduce CO2 emissions. Actually, we have ended up with a more expensive system and more CO2 emissions, and therefore I think for energy-intensive industries, they are less competitive compared to the Americans, and I think you see more or less daily that there are quotes or announcements that European energy-intensive companies are planning to make investments in the US. So I think the key point here to me is that we need simple mechanisms, and we need mechanisms that are global, because that is much easier and more efficient for companies, and you avoid carbon leakage from one area to another.
Right. Well, as everyone knows, gas in Europe is a really big subject right now, and maybe a couple of questions in that area. One is, can you contrast, I mean, you're the second, as Jason pointed out, second largest gas producer or supplier in Europe. The different attitude towards natural gas in Europe as opposed to the US, different kind of primacy?
Well, to me, it's a kind of a paradox that gas is struggling more in Europe than it did a few years ago, and that we're in many areas coal is preferred with more CO2
Can you explain that?
Emissions. Well, I think they have focused a lot on the renewable energy share, i.e. how much renewable you are put into the energy mix, instead of focusing on reducing CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. And then, of course, in America and in the US, you have a very innovative industry. You have been able to develop new technologies. You have good rocks so that you can efficiently develop shale, and that is more challenging in our view in Statoil in Europe.
Right. Well, the big question is Ukraine, European gas security, with this kind of unfolding crisis that goes through another turn yesterday. What's the impact? What does this mean for the European gas industry, for energy security in Europe?
Well, short term, there are no issues with gas supply in Europe, because in Norway we are used to very cold winters and we go cross-country skiing. But this January we were watching people at Manhattan going cross-country, and you had a very mild winter or cold winter here and mild in Europe. So storage in Europe is full, and we go into the summer season. So I think short term, no issues on gas supply. Medium term, I think there are issues one can do in terms of maybe some more production in Holland, some more production in Norway. You can
there's no slack now in the North Sea. There's no surplus production capacity.
Well, they are regulated by production permits. But I think the key point is that medium, longer term, Norway, for instance, cannot replace Russia. So Russia is important for gas supply in Europe altogether.
So do you see Europe, I mean, will we see a change in European energy policies, do you think, as a result of this?
But I think the most important thing, Dan, you already spoke about, and Statoil is not happy with the current turmoil in the gas markets due to geopolitical tensions, because we think the single most important thing for us, and I think for the climate, is that people trust the long-term delivery of gas, because then it can be more extensively used, particularly in the power sector.
Right. So right now, though, there's no really risk to the gas supplies. You see it now.
Short term,
right.
Longer term, medium term, in terms of cold winter, there are challenges that need to be solved.
Right. Statoil knows a lot about producing oil and gas in the Arctic. Maybe you might tell us how to think about the Arctic, which is a big, sometimes controversial question, and indeed your own projects in the Arctic, including in the Russian Arctic.
Well, my thinking around that, and Statoil's thinking, is that a significant part of the yet-to-find resources in the world is in the Arctic. So that's the first point. Second point, these resources will, in a perspective, be developed. Then I think we debate Arctic too simplistically, because Arctic is not Arctic. We think about Arctic in different categories. You have what I call workable Arctic, which is really what you find in the Barents Sea in Norway. Very tough environment, but it's not permanent ice, not even icebergs. This is well within the capabilities of the oil and gas industry today, and we are operating the LNG Snow White field in the Barents Sea, in the Arctic, and it operates very well. The second category, as I think about it, is stretch Arctic, where the industry need to improve and innovate, introduce new technology, and maybe there are more ice, longer distances from shore, and so on and so forth. And then you have what we call extreme Arctic, where you have extreme or permanent ice, for instance, which is, in my view, we are not mature as an industry to attack those resources at this point in time. So I think we need to do what we have done in the industry, I think, historically, to develop also these resources step by step. And we have learned as individuals that to be alone in Arctic is not a good recipe because it's very cold and unpleasant. I think it's a learning there to the industry that I think Arctic is not a place you go alone. I think this is an area where the industry need to collaborate much more than we have done in the past to drive down the cost and make sure that the logistical systems are good and we can share in cost for that.
Right. And what about your where are you in your Russian Arctic projects?
So our current exposure to Russia is that we have a producing projects. Our share of that is roughly 10,000 barrels per day. It's an onshore facility. Then we have entered into a strategic long-term partnership with Rosneft for exploring for oil and gas in Arctic areas, particularly in the Barents Sea on the Russian side and in the Sea of Otsk. And that has progressed very well over the last few years. And to the best of my understanding, the current sanction regime does not hinder a further development of that. We have also 2 joint ventures onshore in the US where we look for shale and tight oil and gas resources.
Right. Let me then ask you about global prospects for tight oil, shale gas, and also prospects for area opening up, which is East Africa.
Well, our initial thought of, 5-6 years back was that was to look for similar deposits and opportunities that we had identified in the US, also outside the US. And of course, good shales and good rocks have been identified. But if we think about Europe, the Statoil view is that we do not believe that shale will play a very meaningful role in the energy supply in Europe for, in the medium term. Because you need efficient rocks, i.e. so you can do it cost efficiently. You need a regulatory environment that is supporting, shale activities. Europe is typically more densely populated, and, many of these shale, operations are very logistically intensive, and you also need financial incentives for on the ownership side to make it happen. And on top of that, I think it's fair to note that there have been a fair amount of political resistance against shale activities in Europe. So that is the view we take now, that in a meaningful time horizon, i.e. the next 10 to 15 years, we do not think that this will be a very, very important part in Europe. Of course, there are other areas that are interesting from a geological point of view: Australia, Argentina, Russia. But I think people often tend to forget that you need both very efficient subsurface conditions, but also above ground conditions for actually making investments in shale.
Right. Several questions here that come out of your environmental discussion. A number of people in the audience noticed that you called for a high price on carbon, and you quoted Lincoln going day by day. Do you see the path to a price on carbon on a global basis at this point in time?
Well, I'm relatively pessimistic that this will come anytime soon. It has been on the agenda for a long time with very little progress. So I don't think we can rely only on this. Other mechanisms and other actions need to be taken as well. But my key point is really to try to make a framework to deal with CO2 emissions that is not based on picking winners, which I think there is a very tragic history for governments to do, but rather to create a framework where you stimulate the most efficient technology, and so that big and small companies can innovate to deal with it. Norway actually has, and I'm not asking for higher taxes in Norway, but
just have that on the record, please.
It's for the record. But we actually have a CO2 tax of roughly $75 per ton. And I can assure you, every project that is reducing CO2 emissions at a cost of lower than $75 are implemented. So we know that it's working. But of course the problem, if countries do that in isolation, you can easily get carbon leakage. So therefore it's so important that you at least try to create a broader framework.
What has been, again, a couple of questions, what has been your experience with carbon capture and sequestration? Are we there?
Well, we have actually stored CO2 in an aquifer in the North Sea for almost 20 years. We have researched how the CO2 is operating in the storage for all these years, and people can freely go in and work with the data. So we know a lot on that. But that CO2 is taken from the well stream, so it's much easier. And then we have, together with the Norwegian government and a couple of other companies, we have run a public-private partnership for some years in building a test facility where you can sequestrate, take out 100,000 tons per year in CO2 and test technologies, two technologies. The big issue, in my view, and I think in most people's view, is that CCS at this stage is too expensive. So you really need to drive down the cost radically in order for it to be a meaningful tool in the fight for a more carbon-free economy. And then I'm back to what kind of incentives do you create for people to engage in research for those kinds of projects.
And that goes back to a price on carbon. So there are a couple of questions. You spoke about the methane issue. Other big issue is concern about water in terms of shale gas, tight oil, and drilling. What's your perspective on how those issues are being addressed, and to what degree are they actually a constraint on what you're doing?
Well, I think situation on the ground are different in different areas, and in some areas water issues are more important than others. But anyway, I mean, water will more and more be a scarce resource. So I think it's very important that the industry is working to be more and more efficient also when it comes to
and is that happening from your perspective?
Well, I think the industry has this high on their agenda in terms of recycling and technologies that is more efficient also in terms of water usages.
Right. Helga, thank you very much for coming to the center to share your thoughts and perspectives on the oil and gas industry, the environmental issues around it, and the broader issues of carbon and efficiency. Please join me in thanking Helge Lund.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Helga, again, for being here for that really interesting conversation and for your important and unique perspective on so many issues, the energy security issues in Europe, the U.S. unconventional revolution, and climate change issues that we face. We're going to, if you take a look at your programs, switch the next two items on your program, and I'm optimistic and confident that in doing so, by the time we finish with Jim Rogers, John Podesta will be here from the airport. But now I'd like to ask David Sandlow and Jim Rogers to please join me on stage. The future of the U.S. power sector, as many of you know, is one of both great challenge and also great opportunity as we struggle to limit the impacts of climate change, develop shale resources safely, rethink the future of the utility business model, among many other issues. And our next speaker, Jim Rogers, is really one of the most thoughtful, articulate, and visionary leaders in the U.S. energy industry. Jim, as many of you know, served for 7 years until 2013 as the president and CEO of Duke Energy, the nation's largest electric utility. He's won countless awards, served in government as well as the private sector, serves on many corporate and nonprofit boards, drawn particular attention for his outspoken advocacy of federal action to deal with climate change, acknowledging the responsibility that he said he felt given Duke's heavy reliance on coal to generate electricity. and he was a founding member of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, a coalition of business and environmental groups to push for a cap-and-trade program. His expertise extends far and wide beyond that, including serving on the advisory board for the UN Secretary General Sustainable Energy for All initiative. He's working on a book now on energy access in Africa. So few people are as well positioned as Jim to provide insights in a range of energy issues facing us today, and so I'm really grateful to Jim for taking the time to be with us and look forward to his conversation with David. Again, you have index cards. Please write your questions down. We'll collect them, and David will pose them to Jim. So please join me in welcoming to Columbia, Jim Rogers.
So thank you, Jason, and thank you, Jim, for being here. Jim, you've had a remarkably successful and distinguished career in the electric utility industry, and you can tell I'm going to be a very tough interviewer.
I love the start.
Yeah. But the utility industry that you grew up in is undergoing some very fundamental changes now. And there's a lot of commentary about the impact of distributed generation on the business model for utilities. Here in New York, the Public Service Commission just released a major report on this topic last week, and it's seeking comment on very fundamental changes to the way utilities are regulated. What do you see happening in the next 2 or 3 years in terms of utility business models, and in the next 10 years?
I think as you look out, it's clear that we're on the cusp of significant change in our industry. And many of you would say, well, this is the most capital-intensive industry in the country. They build power plants that last 40 to 60 years. This industry doesn't move very fast. But a point I would make is that there's been a continuous erosion of utility monopoly in this country for over 30 years. If you look at the generation sector as a part of it, 19 states have moved to competitive markets in deregulated generation. You have renewable portfolio standards in 30 states. All of these undermine the utility monopoly. On the transmission side, you have the same erosion as we have RTOs or ISOs in 2/3 of the states in this country. And there, the decisions about the building and the operation of transmission is made by a regional organization. And now here in New York, they are focused on the distribution part of the business. And let me say that this change is technology-driven. You will see productivity gains in the generation of electricity as well as in the delivery of electricity. One of the classic issues we've had for many years is 8% line loss, plus or minus. There are technologies today that can reduce that to 2%. That would have a significant impact on emissions in this country if that happened. The third thing is that's going to drive these fundamental changes is productivity gains in the use of technology, use of electricity. That combination of things is going to make a big difference. 2 quick follow-on points to frame the issue. I'm asking y'all to look forward to 2050 with me. Now, some of you are saying, well, Rogers won't be around. He can easily predict that. I want you to know I will be around. My great-grandfather lived to be 104. I'll only be 103 then. So that I have a shot at it. But why is 2050 important? By 2050, virtually every power plant in this country will be retired and replaced. Think about that. Today, 70% of our carbon-free electricity comes from nuclear units. Unless we extend the life of those nuclear units from 60 to 80 years, they'll all be shut down. And we're going to have a question is, do we replace them? Do we increase it? The question with respect to coal, I think at the end of the day, there'll be no new coal plants built over the next several decades, in part because CCS is too expensive. It's going to make it impossible to build. And an interesting thing has happened in this industry. Historically, we emitted 40% of the carbon in the United States. Because of shale gas, we emit much less than the 40%. And here is the paradigm change that most people in Washington have had trouble grasping. Historically, the cleaner the energy, the more expensive it is. Now we're in a situation with shale gas where it's cleaner than coal and cheaper than coal. And as a consequence, gas-fired units are displacing many coal-fired units in this country, and that's why the emissions have come down. But the technology, and people underestimate the technological changes that are coming, whether it's solar on the rooftop, whether it's battery technology, or whether it's a simple example of Google buying Nest. They didn't buy it because Google wants to be in the thermostat business. They bought it because they're going to write the software and understand the algorithms of the use in every home. They want to know that data where they can predict when a refrigerator's going out or when an HVAC system's going out, to mine that data and be able to make sales predicated on predicting the need to replace equipment. So I see traditional utilities under attack. I think the model has to change. And I guess one last point. See, if you go long enough, you kind of avoid the tougher questions. The last point that is important, I think, is that this business model that allowed us to provide universal access at some of the lowest costs in the world of electricity worked great in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, our mission is going to be fundamentally different. We're going to have to clean up our emissions more. We're going to move from being not just a supplier, but an optimizer. And it's going to be far more complex because there's going to be more distributed generation. We deal with millions of random decisions in terms of use every day. But that is going to change our model, whether it moves to fixed variable rates, too technical, formula rates, but the way we're regulated needs to be changed, and that will take time and allow us to be, in a sense, the battery and the optimizer for all providers as well as users, going beyond the meter to the device.
Jim, are you concerned about the stability of the grid under these changes? Germany in first quarter of this year had 28% renewable energy on the grid. Could the U.S. grid handle that level of intermittent renewables on a sustained basis?
I think they're struggling in Germany, and that's a longer conversation. They have a lot more kind of interruptions as a consequence of dealing with the intermediate and bringing online existing baseload units. But the reality is it's not clear how much we can actually handle. I have confidence if we can handle millions of random decisions about use, people throwing the switch, turning on the television, et cetera, that we will develop the capability to handle hundreds, thousands of distributed generation sources, as well as intermediate sources. The open question is that number 20% or 30% or 40%? The other question is do you run your, and this is the problem in Germany, they're shutting down cheaper nuclear units. They're actually shutting down a lot of nuclear units, but that's a longer story. But they're shutting down nuclear units in order to take higher price renewables. And that is undermining their ability to maintain their, as said earlier, to maintain their energy-intensive industries in the country.
Let me ask you one more quick grid question before turning to another topic. There's been a lot of discussion there needs to be about the security of the grid. In my years at the Department of Energy, we spent a lot of time working on cybersecurity issues related to the grid. And there were a recent article in the Wall Street Journal about physical security of transformers. Do you have any thoughts on the physical security and cybersecurity issues around the grid?
I think this is, if there's ever a reason to modernize the grid, to move from analog to digital, to think about how we can deploy microgrids in the future to island key facilities in the United States, it's now. Our government knows far more about cyber attacks than we do. We're working closely with the government. But quite frankly, our industry doesn't know what the government knows. And so it's very important that the government opens the door and works side by side with the industry to deal with cyber attacks. Terrorist attacks that we're very careful not to talk about because it's so real, it's so possible in terms of the ability to knock out a grid in a key part of the country, and it could be 6 months before it's completely rebuilt. Now, we've taken some steps in terms of the storage of equipment to allow us to move fast to restore it, but virtually every substation in this country is designed a little differently, and so it's very difficult to maintain an inventory that will allow you to replace it if somebody knocks out a substation. We've built in redundancy with substations, but if you're smart, you knock out 4 or 5 substations, and you could bring down a part of New York where they won't have power for 6 months.
Let me turn to another topic. It's been a big week on the issue of climate change, with the US government putting out a major report on the climate impacts that we've already seen here in this country and what's projected to happen. And President Obama's been talking to weather forecasters on the Today Show. I'm sure we're going to hear about this from John Podesta. You've been an outspoken leader on this topic, arguing both that climate change is real and that there are economic opportunities in addressing it. What do you see as the future of climate change regulation in the United States today?
The National Climate Assessment that was just released, 300 scientists doing work over 4 years with peer review, has really confirmed what the IPCC has been saying. And we see it here, and we've made it real with this climate assessment of the United States. I think that is a very important document to help to really educate the American people. One of the biggest impediments to getting a political solution, said another way, to get a price on carbon, is the fact that, according to the Gallup polls, only about 1/3 of the people in this country believe it's a critical issue. Pew Center did a study that said only 40% of the people in this country believe it's a real issue. So this climate assessment will help educate people. But let me tell you what it tells me. When I look at the drought situation in the Southwest and the need to really a deteriorating Colorado River, I look on the East Coast in terms of the problems that are there. I mean, it kind of raises an interesting question. Should you prohibit anybody from building a house on the shore that's closer than a half a mile or a mile from where the shoreline is today? But we need to start thinking about those things. We need to act contemporaneously on 2 fronts. On one front, we need to develop adaptation plans for every region of our country. The very process of creating plans to adapt to the changes that we're experiencing today and we will experience more of tomorrow will help bring attention to this issue and will be part of the educational process that will help us to get political action. I think that's very important. Dr. James Lovelock, who I met with about 5 or 6 years ago, today, still in his 90s, believes that adaptation is critical because we've already gone so far, we're not going to turn the clock back overnight. Now, we got what I call a short-term mulligan when we found shale gas, and it allowed us to reduce our emissions to mid-1995 levels. But that's just, we shouldn't be too comfortable and confident of that fact. So on the one hand, we're building adaptation plans for different regions of the country. On the other hand, we need to put a price on carbon. That needs to get done. Now, I would argue for cap and trade and not carbon tax, and I'd debate that for a long time. But my belief is we need a price on carbon. That is very critical. And quite frankly, companies like ours that build power plants, when we study what to build, we always put a price on carbon in our modeling, a series of prices so we know what the implications are in our decision going forward.
Helga Lund expressed the same view, but was pessimistic about our prospects for actually getting there. Where are you on that? Optimistic, pessimistic?
Helga, I kind of agree with this. It's a global problem. And my pessimism is not driven by the fact that the United States will get its act together around this issue. My pessimism comes from whether we can, the issues are quite different with developing countries and developed countries. There are issues with the ability to bring China on board, who historically it did an incredible thing by lifting 400 to 500 million people from poverty, but they did it by building a coal plant every week. And so that is not a solution going forward. To get a consensus worldwide, I think is, to stay with my golf analogy, is a long putt. So I share his pessimism on that. But to get our act together in the United States, I'm optimistic, because when people see this assessment, they start to build adaptation plans in different regions. They start changing the local laws to address these issues that are occurring. That will educate our people, mobilize people. And the other thing that Helge said that I really agree with, at the end of the day, shale gas was a technological innovation. There are many technologies being developed today that are going to reduce the carbon footprint of our country. We need to tighten our appliance standards. We need to tighten our building standards. 40% of our carbon comes from buildings. We need to tighten that, not just with new buildings, but with existing buildings. There is a lot we can do. Cities are doing it, states are doing it. We just can't get Washington to behave in a functional way with respect to this issue.
Let's look abroad for a minute. I understand you are writing a book on energy poverty, Jim. Why?
It's a story that really goes back to a time I spent in Kenya with 4 of my grandchildren, and part of being there was not just to do the typical safari, but to also visit many of the villages that are in Kenya, really to help my grandchildren have a sense of what life is like in other parts of the world. 3 of them live in California, and they need a lot of help. And so my point here is we were in one village, and there was a guy in Kenya, and not surprisingly, a young man had an Obama t-shirt on, but he also had a cell phone. But there was no electricity in the village. And I said, well, how do you charge that cell phone? He says, I walk 3 hours to charge the cell phone. And that got me started thinking about it, and I created a little foundation that's distributed about 50,000 solar lanterns that also charge cell phones. But then I stepped back and said, that's just the first rung on the ladder. We got to do more. But we can't do what the Chinese did. They, quite frankly, don't have the economic capability to pay for coal plants and transmission and distribution as we know it in the United States and we know it in the developed world. So we need to look at a way forward. There's many efforts going on, but ultimately a microgrid approach with solar, with battery technologies, maybe use a little diesel generator, is going to be really a key to getting this done. There's lots of impediments. I mean, the kerosene industry is an impediment to bringing electricity to many of these villages. Other impediments are the government, the state-owned utilities often are an impediment to seeing that happen. So what I'm doing is trying to and nobody has really written a book that puts a spotlight on the problem, puts a spotlight on the efforts that are being made, which I would say, my judgment now is they're very fragmented and they vary from country to country. It's focused not just on Africa, but India and Indonesia and remote locations in Latin and Central America. And then lastly, I'm going to try to paint a way forward, a roadmap, the concept of impact investing, with the Brits have really developed more than we have in the United States in terms of how that can be used to build a business model that's sustainable. My last observation, David, is this. We do a great job of delivering vaccines to Africa. We do a great job of helping with water supply. But those siloed efforts are not sustainable until they have access to electricity. The only way they can have a sustainable future is to have access to electricity. Let me say it a different way, in a more provocative way, and I haven't really completely got my head around this thought. It is central to modern life. It's essential to be lifted from poverty to have access to electricity. And with access to electricity, you have access to the internet. And access to the internet, I believe, is essential to be lifted from poverty. The question really is this a right of every individual on the planet? a right, just like clean air or clean water, a right to have access to electricity as well as to the internet. And the last point I'd make is also for the US audience, we will do things with microgrids in Africa and India. They're being done today. We will learn, because that's a blank sheet of paper, that there is a concept I call reverse innovation that will allow us to take those developments, bring them back to the United States, and accelerate the modernization of our system to deal with the cyber attacks and the terrorist attacks that you suggested a few moments ago.
I know you spent some time in China in the past few years and explored possible partnerships. And as you think about the energy poverty problem, do you see lessons from the Chinese experience over the past several decades? China's lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty, and has brought energy to hundreds of millions of people that didn't have it before. Are there lessons? Are there warnings?
That's why I do think there are many lessons you can learn from what the Chinese did. I applaud what they did from the standpoint of lifting people from poverty. I think only now they recognize they have a huge environmental problem and they're in the process of cleaning it up. So I'm somewhat optimistic that they will clean up their emissions. The fact that they're building 29 nuclear stations tells me that they want 24/7 electricity with zero emissions of carbon to be able to replace some of those coal plants that they have, the older ones that have been built at earlier times. I also think that the Chinese are, they lead the world in solar panel production, they lead the world in wind turbine production, they're going to lead the world in the building of nuclear. All of them are carbon-free technologies. So I think the Chinese, while they might not be talking about putting a price on carbon, they're putting their money and their energy into new technologies and developing technologies that will be competitive, and I think that's the real difference that they're making.
Maybe just come back to the United States for a minute, since you mentioned nuclear, and just get your thoughts on the nuclear industry here. Obviously, some challenges with cheap natural gas, but certainly an important source of carbon-free electricity. What do you see as the future of nuclear here in the United States, Jim?
As I mentioned a moment ago, nuclear today is 70% of our carbon-free electricity. If you shut every nuclear plant, you made the decision that Germany made, and I think it's for a country that's really focused on reducing their emissions, to shut down nuclear plants with zero emissions and burn more coal from the United States. I'm sure the coal producers are excited about that decision, but it's not a good decision for the planet. It's not a good decision for the people in Germany or in Europe to do that. We're going to have to make some tough decisions. Do we extend the life from 60 to 80 years? I'm in the camp that believes probably not. I believe the new technology, like the AP1000, is a much better technology to be deployed. I also know that the Chinese have taken that technology and have negotiated the rights to build a more advanced technology called the CGEP 1400. That will be even a better technology, and they're going to be able to build the plants faster and cheaper than we're going to be able to do here. Plus, they're going to have the supply chain develop from the building of the ones that they're building. So I think if you're serious about climate, you got to be serious about deploying nuclear. And there is a growing momentum around that point of view. A lot of people in the 70s and 80s fought nuclear because of proliferation, but when you have the Chinese building so many and plants being built in the Middle East and Pakistan, they're built all over the world, this proliferation argument might have worked in the 70s, but doesn't work today.
Jim, we got a few questions about education. Not surprising that since we're here at a university, and a couple people wonder about whether the utility industry today has the right type of graduates coming to it in order to staff them. Were you able to hire? And then we got some more targeted questions that I think may come from job seekers about what are you looking for? Any advice to the students here who might be looking for a job, say at Duke Energy or another major utility in the next year?
What was not surprising but great for our industry is when we had the crisis of 2008 and 9, all of a sudden we were hiring a lot of smart people from universities that we hadn't been able to attract people from because they said, well, maybe banking isn't the perfect thing, And so they found their way into our industry. But the people that come to our company come with a mission. They don't just come because they want to be in a power company. They come because they want to change the world, and they know today is the time to do it with respect to the provision of electricity and doing it in an environmentally responsible way. So the people that we attract tend to want to work. I mean, we have a renewables business where we spent Duke, I'm no longer Duke. 25 years as CEO, it's hard to kind of just flip it off in 3 months and say, I'm not there anymore. But Duke invested $3.5 billion in wind and solar. People that come to our company want to work in that part of the business. We have a chief technology officer who basically has looked at 700 different technologies, and we're experimenting with 5 different battery technologies, and we have the largest battery, a 36 megawatt battery at our wind farm in West Texas. Actually, the wind farm's called No Trees. If you were there, you'd understand why. And it's called that. But importantly, I think this is a perfect time to come into our industry because we have to shape public policy. We have to shape state policy. We have to have people that want to deploy new technologies, experiment with new technologies, and help develop new technologies for the future.
And do you have any advice about the type of training that somebody should have looking for a job? Are you looking for engineers? Are you looking for finance people, lawyers? What type of skills are you looking for?
All of the above. I mean, the reality is that we need engineers, but we need people that are not always solving for one right answer. Often engineers and finance people, and we have a lot in our company of both, often seek one right answer. The reality is, in a world of public policy, in a world of such change, there is a lot of ambiguity. And the ability to deal with the ambiguity and make the right business decisions, I think, is really the skill set we need. And that you can come from multiple disciplines. I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, and I wouldn't recommend that today, by the way. But as a lawyer, you know how to deal with ambiguity, and you're not always solving for one right answer, because there could be multiple answers. And quite frankly, the greatest business decision, Helge would say this also, the greatest business decisions are not black or white. There's a lot of ambiguity, and at the end of the day, there's some act of faith in the decision that you make. And I think that is really critical.
Great, Jim. Final question. As you said, you've been retired for 3 months after 25 years of leadership in the industry. Any reflections on retirement? How is it?
First of all, I don't use that word. I use reinvention.
Good.
I'm in my 5th reinvention. I was a newspaper reporter. I was a lawyer for a decade in and out of the government. I was in the power sector. I ran the largest gas pipeline network in the country, and now I'm on my 5th reinvent. And so I think the opportunities now are greater than any other time for this reinvention because of the changes that are occurring in the power sector and the demands of this next generation. People that are attending this college that want us to provide low-cost electricity in this country, but they want to do it in a clean way. And we need to solve that problem.
Thank you, Jim. Please join me in giving Jim Rogers a big hand. Well, thank you again, Jim. So it's both an honor and a lot of fun for me to introduce one of my heroes, John Podesta. So Mr. Podesta brings to this stage wisdom gained from a remarkable career. In the 1990s, he served as Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. In the last decade, Mr. Podesta founded the Center for American Progress, which under his leadership became one of the most respected think tanks in Washington with deep and profound impacts on the national agenda. In 2008 and early 2009, John Podesta served as co-chair of the Obama-Biden transition where he won widespread praise for his work under enormous pressure. And today, Mr. Podesta serves as counselor to President Obama, and I can tell you that around the Obama administration and Washington, there were a lot of happy people when John agreed to serve in this job. I actually don't use the term hero lightly, but I can tell you there are several generations of Washingtonians whose careers have been shaped by John Podesta, who look up to and admire John Podesta, and who have learned time and time again from his example. So I count myself among them, and I'm honored to present to you John Podesta.
Good afternoon, everyone. And that was quite an introduction. I'm not quite used to that, David. So thank you. You're too kind. It is really great to be here. I almost didn't make it, but I did make it. LaGuardia being what it is. I'm glad that our national energy infrastructure is better than our airport infrastructure in New York City. But it is really a tremendous opportunity to be here. At the first birthday party of the Center on Global Energy Policy. I caught the tail end of Jim Rogers' talk, and I have to say, Jim, I long to use the term retirement, but I'll remember the reinvention part. I know from personal experience that in building the Center for American Progress, as David noted, how much thought and planning and hard work it takes to stand up a thoughtful, policy-relevant research institute. And given the rapid pace of change in energy policy and in energy technology, this center has a particularly challenging task before it. It's just been 1 year since it was launched, but already the Center for Global Energy Policy has already become really a go-to place for policymakers for its thoughtful and rigorous analysis of the issues. And of course, it's great public conversations like the one you all are having here today. So I want to begin by congratulating Jason Bordoff and David Sandelow and the rest of the team for a tremendous first year. It's always great to see friends succeed, and you guys, I think, are really knocking it out of the park, so congratulations. And thank you for having me here today. I'm eager to take your questions, so I'll keep my remarks short. I want to reflect briefly on the President's approach to energy policy and to share with you some updates on the climate action plan that the President laid out last summer. This has been a busy week for us who are working on energy and climate, and there's more to come this week, and I'll have a couple things to say about that. As you all know, the United States is, of course, in the midst of a domestic boom in our production of both oil and natural gas. We've surpassed Russia in production of natural gas. It's projected that we will continue to lead the world in natural gas production through 2030. For 6 straight months now, we produce more oil domestically than we've imported from overseas. The U.S. is the top oil and gas producer globally. Domestic energy production has created 133,000 jobs in the last 3 years, and those numbers are projected to keep growing. That's good news for our economy, which you will hear more about from Jim Stock, a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, who's on the panel to follow. And it puts us on the right path forward as we take on the climate challenge. Electricity production fueled by natural gas throws off half the CO2 pollution as coal-fired power plants. Responsibly extracted and carefully transported natural gas provides a credible bridge for an economy powered by dirty carbon-intense fossil fuels to a low-carbon and ultimately no-carbon energy future. I want to be clear, like all fossil fuels, natural gas production poses challenges. In particular, methane leaks at all stages of natural gas production and distribution are a cause of serious concern. Methane is the second most prevalent greenhouse gas emitted in the United States, and though it lingers in the atmosphere for less time than carbon dioxide does, it's more potent, pound for pound. Methane has a climate change impact that's 20 times greater than CO2 over a 100-year period. That's why the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy have been working with oil and natural gas companies to adopt proven cost-effective technologies to reduce methane emissions at all stages of production, storage, and distribution. And the White House recently released a methane strategy designed to reduce harmful emissions of that potent greenhouse gas during natural gas production and transportation. Many aspects of natural gas and oil production are regulated at the state level, as probably most of the people in this room know. But as part of the administration's methane strategy, the EPA is soliciting expert input on how best to reduce methane emissions from the oil and natural gas sector. Later this year, the Bureau of Land Management at the Department of Interior will propose updated standards to reduce venting and flaring from oil and gas production on public lands. The strategy also includes message for controlling methane emissions from other sources, including landfills, coal mines, and agricultural production. So even as we're producing more oil and natural gas at home, we're also cutting our energy use. I want to underscore that. We're also making we're cutting our energy use dramatically by boosting energy efficiency. Improvements in efficiency, from fuel economy standards to better building codes to energy-saving devices to higher standards, have been driving down the amount of energy necessary to produce a dollar's worth of goods or services, a measure that economists refer to as energy intensity in the economy. Domestic oil and natural gas is only one side of the energy production coin. During President Obama's time in office, we've also seen a truly historic expansion of renewable energy, particularly wind and solar. The amount of energy produced from wind power has tripled. Solar power production has increased by tenfold in the time that the president has been in office. We've gone from virtually zero renewable energy produced on public lands to permitting enough solar to power 6 million homes, along with policies to produce more energy from both onshore and offshore wind, as well as geothermal. And distributed solar power has been booming at the same time. Every 4 minutes last year, another home or business went solar. The truth is, we've been fueling our economy in ways that are harmful to the environment, in ways that spew carbon pollution into the atmosphere, in ways that raise temperatures and sea levels. But there's no silver bullet that will take us from a carbon-intensive energy sector to a low-carbon energy sector overnight. We have to be honest about that, and we have to be practical about that. This is how we make progress. It takes time. It can be hard. It's often more piecemeal than we'd like. It takes public will, and it takes private action. We have to keep pushing for the best outcome in the medium and long term, but that doesn't mean we can give up on any particular strategy. And it's important, more important than ever, that we keep pushing forward on these issues. Earlier this week, the administration released the third National Climate Assessment. More than 300 scientists from the public and private sectors worked for 4 years to produce the assessment, which provides the most granular information we've ever had about how climate change is already impacting the United States and what various regions can expect to see in the future. More torrential downpours in the Northeast, sea level rise and coastal erosion in the Southeast, more drought in the Southwest and hotter forest fires, a longer growing season in the agricultural Midwest, but also more extreme weather events that can cut production, more ocean acidification. In many places, these effects are already being felt and will only get worse in the years ahead. The president has said many times, and he said it to a lot of weather forecasters in a bunch of interviews in the Rose Garden on Tuesday, that he believes that we have a moral imperative to act on climate change. That we must not leave the planet that is damaged and degraded, that our children and grandchildren deserve better. That's why last June, as I noted, the president released his Climate Action Plan, which aims to mitigate climate impacts through reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to build resilience in American communities to the climate impacts we know are coming, and to lead on the international stage to find global solutions to what is truly a global challenge. I see my friend Lord Mandelson in the front row. I'm sure he'll be talking about that in the panel to follow. Beyond scaling up renewable energy and transitioning to lower carbon fossil fuels like natural gas. We've been working hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through a variety of methods. We instituted historical fuel economy standards for passenger vehicles, as well as the first ever standards for heavy-duty trucks. Those standards will cut 6 billion tons of CO2 pollution, reduce oil consumption by 12 billion barrels, and save consumers $1.7 trillion over the lifetime of the program. We're raising efficiency standards for commercial and home appliances. Just today, DOE issued final standards for electric motors and walk-in coolers and freezers that will cut carbon pollution by 158 million metric tons and save consumers and businesses $26 billion on their electric bills. And the EPA is on track. We're all hard at work at this, but the EPA is on track to release draft rules in early June to reduce carbon pollution from existing power plants. I refer to this as the crown jewel of the Climate Action Plan. Power plants produce fully a third of the carbon pollution in the U.S. each year and are the single largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the country. Reducing those emissions is important for the health of our environment, the health of our people, and the health of our economy in the long term. And reducing carbon emissions from power plants is one of the best means we have to reach the President's goal of reducing emissions in the range of 17% relative to 2005 levels by 2020, a pledge he made in Copenhagen. We're also working hard to help American communities build more resilient infrastructure and better plan for future climate impacts, and we're getting the private and philanthropic sectors to join us in that effort. Recently, we built on the administration's long history of open data projects and launched the Climate Data Initiative by releasing more than 100 large data sets, maps, and other resources on sea level rise and coastal flooding. Not only can innovators and entrepreneurs go to climate.data.gov to access that information and build new tools for the public, but we partnered with a host of companies and organizations from Google and Microsoft to the geospatial technology company Esri that's actually working right now to provide better public service on the tornado-stricken South, to the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation, who have all made serious commitments to make resources and platforms available for this critical work. I refer to this as maps and apps. Very important, I think, going forward for our communities to be able to plan for the future. On the international stage, the U.S. is leading the charge to end public financing for conventional coal-fired power plants overseas, except in the poorest countries. Recently, the Netherlands and the UK joined us in that commitment. We're also actively engaged in bilateral talks with partners who will be critical in curbing climate change, including China and India. David and I were in China last fall and to try to further that dialogue. Now I sit with an official hat, and I'm still at work at it. And recognizing that that climate change is a security challenge as well as an environmental and an economic challenge, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel just recently and prominently, including discussions of climate change and natural disaster response in the first meeting of ASEAN defense ministers on U.S. soil. Tomorrow, the President will be making some big announcements on new commitments from both the federal government and the private sector to improve energy efficiency in buildings and to expand solar power, particularly distributed solar, while he's out in California. So I'd pay attention to the news tomorrow. I think we have some good things happening and good announcements coming. Taking on climate change and transitioning to a cleaner energy future is going to require an all-hands-on-deck effort from the public sector and the private sector, from researchers and activists, from committed students like many of those who I know are in the audience here today. And it's going to take the research and engagement of organizations like the Center for Global Energy Policy. It's, in my view, perhaps the biggest challenge facing the world. So Jason and David, thanks for taking it on. Thank you again for having me. And I think I have some time for questions. I think, Jason, we're going to do that up here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, John, and thanks for being here today and on short notice and for dealing with traffic problems. A lot of things to cover. That was really great and comprehensive. You touched on this early in your remarks, but I just want to give you a chance to say one more word about it, which is the all of the above approach to energy and what that phrase means. So we have an oil and gas boom happening in this country, not just natural gas, and that's displaced coal. We have an oil and gas boom, and the president has spoken favorably about increasing domestic production. At the same time, we saw this week the urgency with which we need to deal with climate change. So I was wondering if you could talk about what the phrase all of the above means. I think some people, when they think about it, view those things as irreconcilable or being in tension. And can we do both, and should we do both?
Well, Dana Milbank referred to me as sounding like Dick Cheney for comments like that. But I think for a lot of reasons we have to do and pursue multiple strategies at the same time. I think the oil and gas boom right now in the U.S. has been, as I said, a boon for the economy. It creates a sense of energy security for our country. It's produced low pricing for natural gas, which has both helped in the manufacturing sector as well as reduced bills for consumers in the production of electricity. It's also reduced CO2 emissions. So we've reduced since 2006 we've had more reduction of CO2 emissions in the United States than any other country on the planet. And that's in part because of the fact that we've done fuel switching, I think, in the electricity sector, along with the other parts of the all of the above strategy. And I underscore what I said earlier, which is making our economy use energy more efficiently. And I think that the big gains we've seen in the transportation sector, now in the built sector, we're having a Better Building Summit in Washington, which I left to come up here. And the president will be making some announcements about more both public commitment to that, the federal government, which is the largest user of energy as an entity in the world, I guess, and as well as some major private sector commitments to reduce their energy by 20% by 2020. Those are, multiple strategies. They go along with the other elements that I mentioned that come from the Climate Action Plan that begin to transition the U.S. economy to one that's more efficient, more productive, using lower carbon intense fuels to fuel the economy, and ultimately move towards an electric system that is going to have to be literally carbon free. Now that can happen through the use of fossil fuels if we get the carbon capture and sequestration or utilization right. That's a ways off, in my opinion, still. But there's research support for that. But primarily, we're going to have to find sources of energy that move, particularly the electricity sector, to essentially a carbon-free system.
And you mentioned the sort of crown jewel of the Climate Action Plan, the EPA rules, and so I know they haven't been proposed yet, so you won't tell us too much about what they'll say, but what can you say about what people should expect, what they're trying to achieve? 40% of the electricity mix still comes from coal. You can't, you don't want to turn that off overnight. How should we think about what they're trying to achieve and how flexible they can be in terms of a tool?
Well, Gina McCarthy, our EPA administrator, has been all across the country talking to stakeholders, from political officials, governors, state regulators, to affected utilities, to stakeholders across every sector of the economy, as well as advocates for a lower carbon future. And she has produced a draft of a proposal which is now at the White House. It's it's under review in the interagency process. The president asked that that proposal be released by the first week of June. I think we're on track to meet that deadline. And what that's going to end up doing is regulating CO2 as a pollutant, the way we have regulated other harmful pollutants, arsenic, mercury, other, NOx and SOx. And it's being done through a section of the Clean Air Act that requires states essentially to implement the reductions. So different states have different mixes, they have different opportunities, they have approached this problem in different ways. Up here in the Northeast, there's a mass-based system called RGGI that combines states to try to get overall CO2 reductions. Other states will take a different approach. But the rule will be flexible enough to produce, to give states the flexibility they need based on their own circumstances, their own mix of facilities, but to begin to regulate those emissions from existing power plants, again, to get on track to meet aggressive targets, but do it in a flexible way that can be cost effective, and ultimately in a way that the benefits of the rule will far exceed the costs that are going to be imposed. I think this is one of the rules, in my experience in the federal government, that has one of the biggest benefit to cost ratios that I've seen come through the system, because there are both benefits from reducing the CO2 from a climate perspective, but there are also very, very substantial public health benefits that'll flow from having a cleaner electricity generation system.
There's a question here about public acceptance of shale development and hydraulic fracturing. Obviously highly controversial, as you know. What do you think are the greatest risks to shale development? Do you think regulations, state and federal now, are where they need to be? If not, where do they need to be improved? And how can we build more public acceptance toward development of that resource?
Well, look, I think that, first and foremost, it's up to there are different layers of regulation, and the thing that I think has been of greatest concern to the public is starting with the lack of transparency on the fluids that go into fracking the rock to release the hydrocarbons, and the potential for particularly groundwater pollution. That's largely been left to the states to regulate. I think that states have taken different approaches on this. I think that it is the EPA is still doing, it does research, although they don't regulate in that area. They're doing research on how to maintain and develop better and best practices in that regard. But I think there has to be transparency. States have to step up to the plate and do a good job with this. I think the companies have to be, come forward with, but both by implementing best practices and to some extent being more transparent with the public about what their activities are doing. There are a host of other issues, from breaking up of landscapes to the effects of methane leakage in the development of oil and gas. That's what I mentioned in my opening comments. That's a place where the federal government has an important role to play. I mentioned the methane strategy we recently released, which is a multi-sector strategy, includes agriculture, landfills, et cetera, but it pays particular attention to oil and gas production and transportation. There's a lot of leakage also in the transportation system. We have a big challenge ahead of us in replacing aging pipes, et cetera. But at the production level, EPA is engaged now in an exercise in which they've released a number of white papers. They're asking for expert comment. They're looking towards moving forward in the fall with trying to determine what the right path forward is to ensure that methane leakage is kept to a minimum. The Department of Interior is also in the process of issuing regulations that would reduce flaring and venting from production that occurs on public lands. So those are two very big initiatives, but with the same aim, which is to minimize the leakage that comes from oil and gas production, all the way from production to collection to transportation and distribution. And I think that the Department of Energy has a pretty cooperative relationship, particularly with a number of the big players in both the production and transportation side. They're looking at, when David was at the department, they put a lot of money into better technology for, at every stage of the production and distribution side. So, I think we can do it safely, but we have to be vigilant about trying to have the best practices And that requires commitment from every level of government and from the companies themselves.
One of the results of the tight oil boom we've seen is a dramatic increase in the amount of oil we're moving by the greatest innovation of the 19th century, the locomotive. We saw yet another derailment and explosion last week. Yesterday, in fact, the administration announced new notification rules for trains carrying Bakken crude. I was wondering if you could talk about the issue. Do you think stronger federal regulations are needed for moving oil by rail? Do you think the recent rail accidents are an indication more pipelines are needed?
Short answer is yes. I think that the Department of Transportation has, again, just sent over to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs a draft proposal that would improve rail car safety in particular. And I'm probably not an expert in anything, but I'm certainly not an expert in this. But Bakken crude in particular is highly flammable for reasons that Dan Yergin can explain. So the big explosions we've seen up in the Bakken area have resulted in major fires, though. But there was a very substantial incident in Virginia just this last week. So rail car safety, I think, is something that's really a top of the agenda item for the Secretary of Transportation. And as I said, they've been developing, in addition to the notification rules, they've been developing new safety rules for the rail cars themselves. The Canadians are also, which also move and have suffered from the same problem of rail car explosion and massive fires, are also in the process of updating and strengthening their rail car safety rules as well.
And another policy issue that's arisen as a result of how quickly the U.S. energy landscape has changed is energy exports. The U.S. Energy Department has approved 7 applications to export LNG. The question of the restriction on crude oil exports has also come up, even though we're still a net importer because of the way our refineries are configured and the kind of oil we're producing in the U.S. versus what our refineries are configured to take. I'm wondering if you could speak to each of those in terms of where the LNG export approval process is headed. Should we expect those approvals to continue on the pace they've been? And then for crude oil exports, how does the administration think about the issue?
Well, we've done, there are different regimes for exporting to countries for which the U.S. has a free trade agreement and which it doesn't. But so in the non-FTA countries, there's a process at the Department of Energy to give preliminary licenses, and then there's a further process at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and a final approval by the Energy Department. And they've did a preliminary assessment about how much exports to non-FTA countries would be consistent with a national interest finding, including what the impact would be on domestic price, manufacturing, consumer pricing, et cetera. And they've moved forward with preliminary licenses, if you will. Those are now mostly moving through FERC. One's been granted and is in the process of being built to Cheniere in the Gulf region. But the total volume, to give you some indication of this, total volume of exports that would be permitted under those preliminary licenses is equal to the total amount of LNG that the EU currently imports, about the amount that Qatar, the leading country that exports LNG, exports, and it's about half the Russian imports into the EU today. So they're very, very substantial amounts that have already been licensed for export, but those facilities take some time to be built. So the one that's gone all the way through the process and is in the throes of being built, the one I mentioned, won't be online till I think the end of 2015. But between 2015 and 2018, I think you could see much more substantial natural gas exports from the U.S. to, the market will decide where those exports go. There's been a lot of discussion about this because of the situation in the Ukraine, but the market ultimately will decide where those exports go. But putting that gas into the global system, I think, will help, even if the end destination for the gas is what, if you look at the economics, maybe more likely is to Asia. Having that gas in the global system will help relieve pressure and provide alternatives across Europe, which needs to, I think, improve its energy security, particularly vis-a-vis Russia. So I think, we're on track for that. With respect to oil exports, there's some oil exports that currently go on today under presidential waivers and because they're not passing through federal pipelines. But we're taking an active look at what the production looks like, particularly in Eagle Ford in Texas, and whether the current refinery capacity in the U.S. can absorb the capacity to increase, to refine the product that's being produced through the boom in the Bakken and Eagle Ford and other areas around the country. I see Dan Poneman standing on the side, our Deputy Secretary of Energy, and he'll correct anything that I misspoke about. But we're taking a look at that and deciding whether there's the potential for effectively and economically utilizing that resource through a variety of different mechanisms.
Yeah, Dan Poneman is there, and Sharif Suki, the CEO of Cheniere, is here as well. So 2015, is that right? That's when the first project for LNG exports. Well, so we got one thing right. Tell us what the Quadrennial Energy Review is and what it will look like and what your hopes are for and what it aims to achieve.
Yeah, we've got lots of quadrennial reviews now in the government, built around the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is an extremely important planning document for the Pentagon to kind of scope what the future looks like and size both the force and the platform development process based on a national strategy in the defense area. That has caused other agencies of government and the president to focus on the methodology as an important input to federal policy making. So there's a quadrennial diplomacy and development review, and now there's a quadrennial energy review, which the president asked that the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Domestic Policy Council at the White House lead, but the bulk of the work is really being undertaken by the Department of Energy. And in the energy review process, it's a little bit of a misnomer because it's over the course of 4 years, we're looking at strategies around some specific cuts in the energy field. The first one, and the new QER as we refer to it, is looking at transportation distribution, both from a security perspective against a multitude of threats, cyber, terrorism, but particularly extreme weather events, to look towards the future of where the energy system's going and decide where greater investment needs to shift to. And again, it's a sort of a massive interagency undertaking to begin to map where we are and where we need to be in the as I said, in the distribution, transmission, and transportation of energy, and it's across all the sectors, electricity, gas, oil, etc.
One last question, and then we'll move to Deputy Secretary Poneman. I wanted to ask you just a little bit more sort of personally, can you tell us how you personally became so committed to the issue of climate change, given how many issues you deal with at the Center for American Progress now in government? You have a particular passion for the issue, it seems to the public, I think. Can you talk a little bit about where that comes from?
Well, I've done a lot of, I've done a lot of different things over the course of my career. I was in the earlier part of my career, I spent much more of my time on another topic that has really become front and center today, which is electronic surveillance and the questions around intelligence gathering, and I'm still working on that. But during my time in the Clinton White House, I really became an advocate for both I developed a greater understanding about the challenge of climate change and an advocate for changing our energy system to react to that. And so I guess I was the green chief of staff amongst the 4 chiefs of staff who served President Clinton. And I carried that work forward and have made, particularly climate and energy, an important pillar of the work that the Center for American Progress did under my leadership and now does under Neera Tanden, who's the new president and CEO at CAP's leadership. So I think we've been important active players. I think some of the policies we developed in the period in 2006, 2005, 2006, 2007 were critical during the transition, which I led for President Obama, in terms of having kind of off-the-shelf ideas on where greater investment could occur. So I'm proud of that. And now, having resisted for a while, I'm sort of back on the saddle and have responsibility in the White House to coordinate the work of the White House offices, including the Council on Environmental Quality, the Domestic Policy Council, the National Security staff that are working on climate and energy, along with OSTP, which was the lead on the National Climate Assessment that I mentioned.
That's great. Well, I know from the people still there how much sense of mission and purpose they have as a legacy issue to deal with climate change, and also to get the policy choices right that have arisen as a result of how quickly the U.S. Energy landscape has changed. I know to all of the people still there how much you've brought to that effort and how grateful everyone is. So, and we're also grateful to you for being here today. So please join me in thanking John Podesta.
Thank you.
Thank you again. We're really honored and lucky and grateful to have you here, John, particularly on such short notice. So next we're going to hear from Dan Poneman, the Deputy Secretary of Energy. Those of you who joined us at our launch event last year may recall that Dan was here as well then. He gave brief remarks and then ran out to the airport, unable to take Q&A, and I promised we would get him back. And true to his word, he is here back again with us today to celebrate our first anniversary event. And I'm really grateful to Dan Poneman for taking time from his demanding schedule to help celebrate the center's first anniversary. Dan has served in the #2 spot at the Energy Department since 2009, playing a key role in virtually every major energy policy action taken by the administration, both domestic and international. He's represented the administration in our diplomatic engagement with numerous energy hotspots, most recently last month, for example, co-chairing the US-EU Energy Council meeting in Brussels that dealt with European energy security and the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Before serving in the administration, he was at the National Security Council, the Scowcroft Group. I had the very good fortune to work closely with Dan for 4 years on a variety of issues, including just at the tail end, a few weeks coordinating the administration's response to the fuel system disruptions in the New York area that we've already talked about. And Dan will be joining us tomorrow at the roundtable on that I mentioned. Dan is just the best. He's a generous colleague, a deeply respected national security expert, a deeply committed public servant. I'm very lucky to say a friend, and I've really learned a huge amount from Dan Poneman over the years. I'm very grateful to have the chance, with all of you, for all of us, to learn more from him this afternoon. So after his remarks, Dan Poneman will be joined on stage by Dan Yergin for another short conversation. Again, if you have any questions, please write them down on cards. We'll pass them to Dan. Please join me in welcoming the U.S. Department of Energy's Deputy Secretary, Dan Poneman.
Well, thank you, Jason, for reading verbatim the introduction I gave you. It really is a pleasure to come back here, and it's great to see so many friends and colleagues. And I am actually reminded of the very, very early conversations that I had with Jason, which is, do you think there's room for another center of energy? There's so many centers on energy policy. Do you think someplace that's committed to fair and balanced analysis, really can make a place in New York City? And I said, yeah, I think so. And if there's any demonstration needed, I don't think there is actually, because this quickly has become the go-to place for all manner of energy discussion on all of the critical issues that we need. And it's probably not coincidental that one of his first coups was to snag, where'd he go? Our Undersecretary David Sandilow and who is now working here with Jason, and I see my other former undersecretary and running partner, Kathy Zoy. It's been an extraordinary run. Jason himself is an extraordinary individual. Not only is he scary smart and a beautiful writer and very articulate, I heard you yesterday morning on NPR, Jason, but if you all remember the movie Zelig, this guy, Jason Bordoff, he is everywhere. And the most telling moment in my recollection of this phenomenon was in the early days of Hurricane Sandy. This was so frustrating not to have 360-degree situational awareness. What's going on up and down the I-95 corridor? What's going on in New York City? What's going on in the boroughs? Which gas stations have gas, no power, power, no gas, both, neither? And we're trying to figure out what's going on in Queens. And I get a phone call, and it's Jason. He says, I'm standing here in Queens, it's open. You know, the SO here is open. So there's no distance that Jason would not go to, no lengths to which he would not go. Look, I've been encouraged by another dear old friend and teacher and mentor, Dan Yergin, whom I've known for almost actually 40 years, which is pretty scary, to be brief, and so I will, so we can have more interesting back and forth. But I'm just going to tee up some observations around 3 plot points. Everybody, I think, has a bucket list. I've always wanted to write a screenplay, and the late Sid Field, who taught many people how to write screenplays, although I don't think he ever actually got one produced, had this description of a plot point where things are going along. It could be dramatic already, but something that spins the plot in a different direction maintains dramatic tension. So I'm going to mention 3 plot points that are of recent vintage and I think worthy of our consideration. Number 1, as recently as, say, yesterday, we had the release of the National Climate Assessment. This is really a profoundly sobering, if not disturbing, document. I encourage you all to take a look on the White House website and see how John Holdren described it. But look, since they've been recording temperatures since 1895, depending on how you measure, you could be between 1.3 and 1.9 degrees, the way to the 2 degrees Celsius that we are trying to avoid if we are to head off the potentially catastrophic effects of dramatic climate change. We have witnessed the other critical threshold, 400 parts per million, that has been crossed and stayed above that level for the full month of April. This is truly disturbing. And again, you don't need scientific instruments to measure that which you read every day in the newspaper. To be out in Los Angeles talking to Governor Brown about the incredible drought that they're suffering out there, and to, obviously, all of us went through the searing experience of Superstorm Sandy. Whether you're in the southeast, worried about the hurricanes that are coming, the northeast, worried about all of the rising waters in your low-lying areas, it's everywhere, and obviously it's around the globe. And there's no place that's immune from it. And in a way, when you think about the manifest warnings that we've had about this, and I think very eloquently expressed in such reports as the recent report Fatih Birol at the International Energy Agency wrote about some of the dramatic efforts that are still within reach of viability, but need to be undertaken with a genuine sense of urgency. That is, I think, a worthy subject of consideration for smart people like are assembled here at Columbia University. And, if I may say, I think that when President Obama chose a suitably sweltering 95-degree day in Georgetown last June to lay out a quite comprehensive set of actions to be taken along 3 very important pillars, all of which are now actively being pursued. And again, we can go more into it in the Q&A, but number 1, we have to continue to do everything we can to mitigate this climate change through such mechanisms as the introduction of more renewable and clean sources of power generation, through the continued work to transform our vehicular fleet to other forms of less carbon-emitting energy, through the whole array of energy finance mechanisms that are now and newly getting introduced, and I think a very interesting and exciting area we can talk about more in Q&A. Second pillar, obviously, mitigation. All the work we're doing at adaptation, We're involved in climate preparedness task forces from coast to coast that are looking at ways to integrate what we're trying to do on the mitigation pillar in a way that makes sure that if we have, God forbid, another episode in which you have to consider such things as evacuation of large metropolitan areas, that you have microgrids that are supporting our transit systems so that when the lights go out in a bunch of homes, that at least critical functions such as transit systems, such as hospitals, continue to operate. And then finally, the third pillar, international leadership. You know, poor Secretary Moniz is just back from having gone at the President's request to Rome to lead a G7 conversation, energy ministerial. He's going to turn around, go back out to Seoul for a clean energy ministerial, and then again at the President's request, he's going to have to head out to Addis Ababa first week in June, and it's a very important task to deal with the energy issues that he's going to at the first African energy ministerial since, I believe, the late Clinton administration. Second plot point, energy security. You know, this has really come home. We knew that it was coming. I invite you to look at President Obama's speech from Georgetown, I believe it was March 2011. We knew it was important not to rely excessively on a single kind of energy, a single source of energy, a single supplier of energy, and all of the events that we are witnessing in Europe and Ukraine have demonstrated this beyond peradventure. We simply need to get better at this. And I personally was very encouraged. I invite you all to take a look at the G7 Energy Ministerial statement. As multilateral statements go, I think you'll find it extremely content-rich. I think you'll find it extremely operational. And I think you'll find it entirely consistent with the President's Climate Action Plan, his commitment to pursue in all of the above energy strategy, his desire to move from words to action in a robust way, and to take our fate into our own hands. Not to use energy supplies as a weapon, not to use energy supplies as a tool of political coercion, but rather for each country to look to its own resources, to look to its own people, to look to its own capabilities, and develop what we have developed, which is as wide a based set of energy options and alternatives as is possible to promote our economic growth, to bring us good jobs, and to lower carbon emissions. Let it be clearly noted that you will not find in the G7 declaration anything that says, well, we can certainly put on hold our concerns about climate change because we've got to get security first. To the contrary, you will find that we can actually work to advance both of those core objectives at the same time. Third plot point, and I will try to be brief so we can get to our Q&A with Dan Yergin, energy finance. And again, the news cycle obliged me a good peg for this portion of the remarks, another plot point, and that is the introduction of the third so-called YieldCo mechanism that pulls together a set of assets, renewable power generating assets that are perhaps backed by a set of power purchasing agreements that have long durations, that therefore throw off a very predictable cash flow over a sustained period of time. Let me just put this in a little bit of historical context and tell you why it is a plot point. In 2009, there was not a single utility scale solar facility in the United States. And through the Recovery Act and through the loan program that was supported by the Recovery Act, we invested in the first 5, including the largest that we now have so far, Agua Caliente. We invested in large concentrated solar. We now have these plants getting built, generating power, and by the way, the next 10 solar facilities attracted private capital. We helped support one of the largest wind farms in the world at Shepherd's Flat. We've supported biorefineries for cellulosic ethanol. Not to preempt private capital, I asked repeatedly, and again, my colleagues can attest because they were on the credit review board with me. I asked, are credit facilities available for this kind of investment? We're not trying to squeeze out private capital. They said, not at that tenor. not at this time. Remember what credit markets looked like in 2009, 2010. And this was taking cases in which we had surmounted the technological risk, but we had not demonstrated that these facilities could be built out viably at commercial scale. And so now the question becomes, having made that level of investment, can we convert this to a model that is scalable? It is often said by people, I believe, that capital markets move more money in a day than governments move in a year. That's what we need to tap into if we're going to scale to the level of investment that's going to be required to transform our energy economy. And now with these yield co's, you have an important test bed for the concept that you can then create an asset class that perhaps through standardization of contracts can be securitized and then bring more capital at lower prices, allowing more small-scale investors to participate in the greatest energy transformation the world has yet witnessed. And that, if I may say, is a subject worthy of the authorship of Mr. Dan Yergin. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let me first observe for those who can see it, and maybe the camera can zoom in on it, Dan is wearing a great tie. He's wearing the all of the above energy tie, which by coincidence I'm wearing too, and this was not planned. Dan, you sketched out a very compelling script, except that I would argue that it's not a film, it's a multi-year TV series, because it's something that will go on. And I thought what we could do is really take up the plot points that you described and fill them in a little bit. As you mentioned, during this Superstorm Sandy, as well as deploying Jason to Queens to check out gasoline stations, you were really at the center of trying to figure out what was happening in this fog of war. Tell us what you've been doing and what the agenda is on resilience since then, where we are today and where you want to push it.
Dan, this is one of the most, to be candid, most dramatic and, for me, startling things that I've experienced in my 5 years at the DOE. It was not, frankly, something that we viewed as central to our activities. But, you know, the old line of Shakespeare, some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon us. Superstorm Sandy thrust greatness upon us in terms of...
Because really there was nobody who was really responsible up until that point, was there?
Well, I want to distinguish. We had, in the classic bureaucratic sense, stovepipes in our department, otherwise known as cylinders of excellence. And one that we worked on intensively and successfully, if I may say, was our nuclear response mechanism, which everyone here probably had a chance to see in Fukushima. So we had a robust capability over here with all the comms and so forth to support it, and we had a more, frankly, modest capability over in the energy assurance side that was looped into the FEMA mechanism, but it just wasn't robust. And so what happened, frankly, when people understandably turned to the Department of Energy during Sandy to say, what's going on with the pipelines? Why can't we get through that bottleneck? We stepped up, we innovated, we did the first ever drawdown from the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve. We got all kinds of waivers to make sure that the fuel could get to the places. We deployed people to all the FEMA regions. But not only did we realize, but it was expected of us post hoc to really build on that. So with the President's support, we're now amping up all of our abilities. We brought somebody over full time to support the Secretary and me in driving this change. We have set up an emergency response council. We now have basically an all-hands approach to this. We met as early as, I think, this morning. And what I think you will find is we're getting more real-time awareness. We're having mobile applications that will allow people, wherever they may be, to find out where the outages are, where the gas stations are on and where they're off. But more than that, we're doing things that will have longer-term ability to be helpful. The Secretary just announced, as I'm sure most of you saw, the gasoline reserve we've had for many years, obviously the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for crude oil supplies, but we now see that there may be need in critical areas for refined product as well to ease some of these critical shortages at critical moments. And this will be the first one, and we're going to take a look at other regions and what's required there. So in short, if you went inside the Department of Energy today, you would see, frankly, a hive of activity that now has become one of our core missions and one that has really gained a lot of attention from the Secretary and from the White House as well.
How will this gasoline reserve work?
Well, first of all, we are confining this in the initial instance to the Northeast, where we found in the case of Superstorm Sandy that had we had a reserve that could bypass some of the places where, such as Linden and some of the terminals, we had specific shortages that were creating real bottlenecks, it can be brought to market. And it turns out that when you get that kind of constraint, that you start to get panicked activities at the level of consumer, where even a modest increment in terms of strategic supplies being brought to the market can have a very salutary effect in terms of keeping lines down and keeping people supplied as they need be. So we're going to basically create two of these, one in New England, one in the New York Harbor region. There is existing capacity available there. We will not need to build new capacity. And so we will effectively lease the storage capacity that will allow this to be put in place. There will be rules that are put in place in terms of when the product is reserved for use for the reserve, and then how that product may be released when the need for it has abated.
Earlier this afternoon, David Sandalow and Jim Rogers discussed the issues of cybersecurity and the grid. That obviously falls under the heading of resilience. It's also something that you have been deeply engaged in thinking of. And tell us how the problem looks to you today, and what are the steps or what needs to be done there?
I think it is a serious problem. As you said, this will have to be part of a multi-part series. There is no solution per se. This became a source of keen awareness, I think, to many people when we saw some of the introduction of denial of services attacks and some of the unfortunate episodes that, as we all know, happened to users like Saudi Aramco, where over 30,000 machines were basically made useless. And we have had a deep and continuing conversation with CEOs across the electric sector, and we've set up actually an energy security coordinating committee. We've done a few things. Number one, there are things that we in government know that they don't know, and we have worked with them to provide access. Obviously, we have to be very careful about sources and methods for some of the information, but it's very important that our CEOs understand the nature of the threat. We've done that. There are things that they know that we don't know, and we've opened up that channel as well. So I think a whole set of activities has evolved around situational awareness on cyber, just as it has on fuel resilience. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's actually surprising the lack of understanding within a number of utilities of the metes and bounds of their own vulnerabilities. So we actually created at the Department of Energy a risk maturity model that was a tool that we piloted with about 17 utilities. Now over 100 have used it to do their own self-analysis to analyze their vulnerabilities. That's the second piece. The third piece is we have a number of cyber tools which we have made available to the utilities. Again, we are very clear that a lot of the capability to come up with these solutions resides not in the halls of government, but out among the utilities. So that's an exchange as well, where they're bringing various tools to our awareness and vice versa. And then the fourth and very important element is we're exercising. We had a very big exercise that was led by the NERC in the summer called GridX2, which posited both a kinetic attack, a physical attack on the grid, as well as a cyber attack, and had utility executives, senior White House involvement, Department of Homeland Security, because what you know for sure is you don't want the real thing to be the first time you've gone through one of these exercises, and you would be surprised at the things that you don't realize that are disclosed by such an exercise. People who don't know what their legal authorities are, people who don't understand the importance of communicating clearly to the American people early in the crisis, and so forth.
So a lot of lessons and a lot of learning over the last 2 years.
A lot, yeah.
So, and a process that continues.
Yeah, and we have quarterly meetings. This is under the Presidential Directive number 21. We're the responsible agency for the energy sector. And I would tell you that they're basically sellout events. Every time we get the highest possible participation from industry. It's been a very robust conversation. When the president came over to talk about the next hurricane season, and he came over in May 2013, a few months after Sandy, the conversation naturally evolved into a cybersecurity conversation. So these actually turn out to be very tightly coordinated activities.
Right. Dan, there are questions here about, and it's already come up, of course, about nuclear power, premature closing down, administration policy on that. And then also, as we talked earlier, it is about 6 years now that the shale gas, tight oil revolution has been going on in the United States, and how the administration sees this. John Podesta gave us some headlines on it, but would like to hear more of your thinking on both of those.
I know we don't have much time. I'll address both briefly. We are concerned about what we're seeing in terms of shutdown. We're down from 104 to 100 operating reactors. There are a number of factors that are responsible for this shift, and part of it has to do with the structure of our markets. And we are, and Secretary Moniz had brought together his Energy Council to look at exactly what measures could be done to make sure that such things as energy security, energy diversity, capacity that is provided by large-scale baseload nuclear power is brought into the discussion in a way that will allow a long-term sustainable approach to the preservation of our existing nuclear fleet, but also pivoting also to opportunities in such areas as small modular reactors to find new business models that may also spell a promising future in the area of nuclear energy. When it comes to the incredible revolution in hydrocarbons, which no one has written about more eloquently than you, it has been transformational, and it's been surprising how quickly it has welled up in the public consciousness. Again, the National Petroleum Council report that you had a major hand in writing, and I think that the fundamental fact of it is this, that it demonstrates a couple of things, maybe not all of which is obvious. This is not some windfall from Providence. These are the results of heads-up, early R&D in these, at the time, abstruse technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, plus subsequent efforts by the Gas Technology Institute, plus certain tax benefits, plus a lot of elbow grease. And, but those early investments that were made by the Department of Energy were very important to the shale gas revolution. Of course, many of those are the same technologies that have brought this prodigious influx of oil to the point where we're at unbelievably 8 million barrels a day of production, heading up to 9.6 according to the Energy Information Administration. People realize this has given us a tremendous opportunity to take this time and the resources that it provides, A, to strengthen our economy, create new jobs, bring back manufacturing, B, when it comes to natural gas, to take that as what has been described by the Secretary as a bridge to the future. It's not the end point, but by converting so much of our power generation to a form of energy that that emits only half the greenhouse gas emissions, we are about halfway to achieving our 17% desired reduction by 2020, but we've got a lot more to do. And so the lesson of that, I think, Dan, is we've got to take the opportunity presented by the tremendous economic benefits that flow from this transformation of our hydrocarbon sector and use that to really double down on our efforts in developing clean energy sources, energy efficiency investments, and so forth.
Right. You mentioned the G7 ministerial that the Secretary just returned from, and you touched on the energy security issues on a global basis. How do you see the coordination of the U.S. with the other countries on energy security? What the kind of agenda is like? And it's obviously been highlighted by events, as you pointed out.
I have to say, Dan, as I've been around the world, and a lot of what we do perforce is of an international character because there aren't walls between the countries and so forth. I have found increasingly over time that there is a convergent conversation. I've been to the International Energy Forum and turned to our Chinese colleagues and hear them talk about the kind of clean energy investments they need to make. David Sandler was a great leader of the electric vehicle initiative that we had going with the Chinese. So I think that there is a growing recognition that this is a global problem. I think there's also a growing recognition that by leveraging our common resources, and by that I mean both enlarging the markets into which we can sell, and then making sure that through such things as standardization of appliance standards, standardization of electrical vehicle plug-in standards and so forth, you have an opportunity to drive down marginal costs by increasing the scale of your market that's available. But at the same time, on something that's as challenging but as essential as carbon capture and sequestration, that basically is larger than any single nation can manage, given how important coal is going to be, ask EIA, ask IEA, for the next several decades, and look at Indonesia, China, India, United States, Europe, we need to pool our efforts. So I don't think there's any question that that third pillar of the Climate Action Plan, which requires international cooperation, is just as important as the first two in getting us where we need to go. And the last thing I would say about that, Dan, is it actually turns out to be, especially since we are in a very favorable position now in our own energy situation, a very strong suit for American leadership, and I think gives us real opportunities to engage with other countries in a way that even just a few years ago I think would have been hard to imagine.
Well, Dan, you described a script with the plot points, and I was processing that. I think that we recognize that you're playing a very important role in writing the energy script that we need for the future, and I invite everybody to thank you very warmly for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Dan. So Dan Yergin should remain here. Thank you, Dan Poneman, for being here. And for your kind words. And I'd like to ask Lord Peter Mandelson and Ambassador Carlos Pascual and Ed Morse to please take seats on stage as soon as the seats have been adjusted. While they're doing that, I'll just quickly introduce our closing panel. Lord Mandelson's a former European Trade Commissioner, British First Secretary of State. He negotiated many trade agreements and led the European negotiations in the WTO Doha round, has held too many senior positions in the UK government to mention, focused on trade, investment, and innovation. And like us here at the Energy Center, also understands the importance of rigorous, policy-focused analysis as president of the Policy Network think tank. So we're honored to have you here, and thank you for traveling from London to be with us here today. Next is my former colleague and friend Carlos Pascual. He leads the recently created State Department Bureau of Energy and Natural Resources. In that role, he's the administration's point person on our diplomatic engagement on many energy issues around the world. Formerly was the ambassador to Mexico and ambassador to the Ukraine, so he has expertise in some particularly important energy hotspots right now. Earlier in his career, worked in the White House on Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia at the National Security Council. So as you can tell, there are a few people better positioned to help us understand the interplay between geopolitics and energy. And I'm really grateful to Carlos for being here and for all I've learned from him and for his distinguished public service and for his friendship over the years. And then finally, we have Ed Morse. Ed is one of the country's leading energy economists, now is global head of commodities research at Citi, and before that, holding similar positions at many other leading investment firms. He co-founded PFC Energy, a leading consultancy, was president of Petroleum Intelligence Weekly. He has worked in his career in government at the State Department, also in academia at Woodrow Wilson School, and many years ago, I won't say how many years ago, as a visiting professor here at SIPA. So few people, I think, embody the center's effort to bring real-world experience and expertise to the discussion of policy as much as Ed, writing frequently in the country's leading newspapers and foreign affairs, including in the most recent issue, and taking time to engage with senior policy officials, and I know they value his expertise a great deal. And most importantly, he serves on the advisory board of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and on a personal note, it was from Ed that I first heard that Columbia was looking for a faculty member with energy expertise to start a new center, so I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Ed. So I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to take a seat now, and we're going to begin our discussion. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the geopolitical impacts of the U.S. energy boom. So you often hear people say things like the U.S. energy boom is having really big geopolitical impacts, and then they give an example, maybe what's happening with Iranian sanctions, but often don't take it deeper than that. And so my question is, can we try to do that in a couple of minutes? What are the impacts? Does the U.S. really engage in the world differently? Do we deal with countries and problems like Syria differently because the U.S. is suddenly a much larger producer of oil and gas? Carlos, can I start with you?
Sure. I think there are two things that one needs to think about in parallel. One is that we have increasingly come to recognize that energy is an issue at the center of the geopolitics of the global system. And this isn't new. Who has resources and who doesn't have resources has had a huge impact on the way countries can wield and influence power. Biggest examples of that have been Russia, Iran, Venezuela in the past. It then goes by a form of logic that if you increasingly have much greater resources yourself, that it puts you in a position to be able to engage in that politics and the engagement of the actions that countries take that influence the global geopolitical environment. Perhaps the area that has been most profound, even I think more so than on Iran sanctions, has been what we've seen happening with the globalization of gas markets, and in particular by the advent of LNG, and we're going to still continue to see that more in the future. As a result of increased supplies of LNG globally, one of the things that Europe has been able to do is increasingly diversify its supplies of energy. That, combined with the very profound changes that have been taking place in the European market, have radically changed that European gas market today from what it was like in 2009 when we saw the last round of the Russian-Ukraine gas wars. Today, Europe is in a position, not perfectly, there are countries that are still 100% dependent on Russian gas, but increasingly we have seen that Europe has been able to bring in gas that at one time was intended to be imported in the United States, and they're not doing that because of our increased supplies of gas. And so as a result of this, we've seen that Europe has been buying gas from Qatar, Trinidad and Tobago, Nigeria, increased gas from Northern Africa, and indeed in 2012, Helge Lund's here, Statoil was the leading supplier of gas in the European market. A fundamental factor for that was the way that the United States' dependence on gas had changed. If we had still been a principal importer of LNG at what was estimated about 80 billion cubic meters a year, those gas supplies would not have been available in the market. And so today, when people raise the question of can the United States make a difference in Europe's energy security and global energy security if we continue as an LNG exporter, this is not a question of meeting supplies tomorrow, but it's reinforcing a very basic concept. If there's a prospect that U.S. supplies will continue to come onto that global market and be available to Europe and throughout the world, if there will be a continued competition for gas supplies, and if consumers have a choice, it eliminates the past prospect of what we had, where between one end of a pipeline and another, you essentially had a monopoly between the consumer and the supplier. And so what we've seen happen already with gas is a nature of competition in Europe, which makes today's crisis in Europe very different from what we saw in 2009 and provides part of the answer of what we need to think about looking ahead, the increased capacity of that competition. I just want to give one other area or example which I think is important that is not always thought about. When you're a principal consumer of energy products and you're seen engaging in markets because you have the need for the commodity yourself, it reduces your degrees of freedom and flexibility in that market. And an area that has become an increasing prospect for energy supplies for the future is the African continent. And one of the critical issues where I think the United States has played a leading role is on transparency and governance issues. Norway has been a key partner in this in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Why is this important? In Africa today, there is more money and capital flight that leaves the continent, principally from extractive industries, than is annually invested in the continent between FDI and international donor assistance. And so one of the things that it's really helped us to do is to be able to engage across the continent, whether it's been on the petroleum industry bill and the implementation of EITI in Nigeria, to working with countries such as Mozambique who are developing new gas resources, to be able to be a force for transparency and governance. Because in the end, that is going to be a basic factor in the ability of those countries to supply their own populations with energy, and is going to be a factor in the willingness of those countries to be able to contribute hydrocarbon resources onto global markets. So just a couple of examples of where it's made a difference. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that you can intervene, that you're not immune from global markets, but it gives us the ability to be able to contribute to transparency and competition in global markets in the way that we haven't been able to in the past.
Dan, and I didn't introduce Dan in my introduction because we'd introduced you earlier in the program, and you would need no introduction, having won the Pulitzer Prize and being widely regarded as perhaps the world's leading energy expert and founder of Cambridge Energy Research Associates. But I wanted to ask you to sort of answer the same question. How do you think, as you look over the history of the U.S. role in the world and the role energy has played, what does it mean that the U.S. is experiencing this energy boom now?
You know, I think as Carlos emphasized, it's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that everything is transformed, which I think was even in the immediate beginnings of the Ukraine crisis, we saw that sense. But it does really change the balance of power in the world to have this position. We can point to other examples that would follow from what Carlos said. If you look at, I mean, imagine if the U.S. was importing LNG today and Japan is in the position it is today. I mean, how would Japan have been able to hold together in terms of access to LNG? That's an example. And another example is the impact of what's happened here on, in part, explaining the reforms that are unfolding in Mexico. So it does take many different forms. And I think since we were here last time, I had the experience of being shouted at by Vladimir Putin about shale gas, so I know how he feels about it, for obvious reasons.
Ed, do you have thoughts on this question of sort of the U.S. Approach to foreign policy?
Sure, I do. I think the setting is one of really disruptive change, and we're trying to, from a policy perspective, people are trying to come to grips with the change. Is the change real? Is it going to be reversed? What are some of the implications of it? And I think, you know, we're now almost at the position where there's general recognition that the ability to exploit these unconventional resources is real, is here to stay, and is here to stay for a very long time. And I think there are two observations I'd like to make along Carlos's line. One is that effectively the LNG business is marketed as though it were a pipeline business. And the advent not just of the U.S. as potentially the largest LNG exporter in the world, but along with the US, Canada, and Australia, is really making a fundamental change in that market. And you know, Sharif's facility is the first one that will make the change because there are off-takers from the Cheniere facility that are going to buy and sell spot. They're going to effectively buying in order to, or committing to buy in order to sell spot. The interesting thing about the US, Australia, and Canada, unlike Qatar, Indonesia, or others in times past, is they can have these anti-competitive behavioral patterns in which they have destination restrictions, in which they prevent the resale of cargoes. And now all of a sudden 3 major OECD countries with traditions of not allowing anti-competitive behavior will be in the market. And it will surely not just encourage, but guarantee the encouragement of a spot market, and it will change the nature of the pricing mechanism. It will deprive countries that are pricing natural gas as though it were oil. It will deprive them of that rent, and the consumer will benefit. And it is a benefit to the world as a whole, for inadvertent, as it were, as a result of this. The other aspect of it, I think, which we will see also over time, is the demonstration effect. Clearly there are many countries that would like to have shale or tight oil resources developed. Some of them have made mistakes. One prominent country in Europe put in a tax system that was so prohibitive that it drove away the investors. And now we're finding among the fastest growing producers in the world, Argentina of all places, where there is the resource base and the desire to get the resources. And they're at a stage that many people who are cynical about whether Argentina would ever attract foreign investment have to take a second look at it. Argentina was producing 12,000 barrels a day at the end of the fourth quarter of last year, and has now doubled that, and it will go up 4-fold between now and the end of the year. That's a remarkable demonstration effect that will, I think, further add to the supply resource being developed on a global basis, and it's because of the demonstration effect coming out of the U.S.
You mentioned Europe. Lord Mandelson, I wanted to ask you to sort of comment for a minute on European energy policy and what your sense is of how well it's working or not working to achieve different policy objectives. Security is one objective, climate change is another objective. There have been concerns that it hasn't been necessarily effective in doing that, but at the same time has had impacts on prices and competitiveness. What's your take on European energy policy, where it's working, where it's not, where it needs to be improved?
Well, if you take a helicopter view of what's going on in Europe, you'd have to conclude that things are not going terribly well. I mean, if you consider the policy objectives that we set for ourselves when I was a member of the European Commission in 2005-06, we wanted cheaper, more efficient, less costly energy. We wanted lower carbon emissions. We wanted to have our economy with a stronger competitive base, and we wanted to play our important role in the world in international climate change negotiations. Well, if you look at the situation now, our energy is more costly. Our industrial base is less competitive. We have poured tens of billions of euros into very subsidy-hungry renewables. And whereas about 10 years ago we were throwing something in the region of 0.24 tons of carbon into the atmosphere for every $1,000 of our GDP, for all the policy focus and drive and money we have spent, we are still now throwing out something in the region of 0.24 tons per $1,000 of GDP. So that is not a very happy situation for Europe to be in, which is why we look at the United States energy revolution with colossal envy. We see what this revolution, this energy boom has done for economic competitiveness in this country, and we've seen too what it has done for your ability to reduce carbon emissions. So, you know, from a European standpoint, you can't blame us for being very jealous. On the other hand, and I want to come back to the point Carlos was making at the beginning, what's happening in the United States has the potential to be a major driver of change in the global gas market for all the reasons that you set out. And that is very, very important for us because in a world where LNG export volumes increase, we will be moving to a situation where gas is more competitive, more mobile, more flexible, more international, or accessible by us at lower cost. And in my view, if you follow that structural trend through, you will identify the silver lining for Europe that comes from the revolution in the United States. It will enable us both to stand back from our current over-dependence on Russia, as Russia's share of the global gas market diminishes, and as we are able to look to more choices, alternative sources of supply, hopefully to the United States, but to Australia, to Qatar, to East Africa in time, Eastern Mediterranean in time, as well as existing suppliers. So short term, we are slightly grisly and envious. In the longer term, we are slightly more optimistic.
And so the U.S. energy boom having more positive impacts in the longer term, you're not concerned about lower priced natural gas, reduced competitiveness, sort of competition for manufacturing, is that?
What can we do about it? We just have to put our own house in order. We've got to take advantage of those changes that are taking place in the global gas market, given that at the moment, you know, we're pouring a colossal amount of money into renewables, increasing at the moment volumes of carbon-emitting coal being displaced from the United States market, throwing nuclear out of the window in many cases, and not grabbing the opportunity that is offered to us of natural gas, of shale, where it exists in different European countries. These are the different factors, and in my opinion, poor policy making that has created not a shambles, that would be an overstatement, but certainly a degree of incoherence in European policy making that we have to find answers to. And I think in the medium to longer term, what's happening in the United States will, as I say, be a driver of a transformation of the global gas market. We have to take greater advantage in Europe of greater gas availability at lower cost, and we've got to organize our energy mix and our policies in a way that enable us to do so.
So staying on the topic of European energy security for a minute, particularly in the context of what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine, Carlos, can you talk for a minute about what role energy is playing in the current crisis? What steps can Europe or the Ukraine reasonably take to reduce dependence on Russian gas, and what steps the U.S. government is taking to help facilitate that? And how important LNG exports, which kind of gets a lot of attention, kind of fits in that versus lots of other things?
Sure. No, I'd be glad to address it, and I'm just literally off the plane coming back from Ukraine, and having stopped in London on the way.
And should add, Carlos was also ambassador to Ukraine, so extra dimension.
Look, one of the issues which is a fundamental factor in question in Ukraine, and it has been in many of the former Soviet countries, is that energy has been a fundamental source of corruption. And in order to deal with the viability of these economies, their politics, the independence of their systems, they have to be able to produce energy, they have to do it on a transparent basis, they have to be able to attract private investors, they have to advance diversification. And so one of the key issues that is facing Ukraine right now is how do they create a picture for an energy future where they can produce more, that it can be done on a competitive basis, that it can attract private investment, and that will give them options for the future. So the first thing on Ukraine that's absolutely critical is to recognize that there is an option for the future, that you're not just playing the short-term game, They have significant supplies of natural gas. Ukraine right now consumes about 50 billion cubic meters of gas a year. About 28 billion cubic meters of that is imported from Russia. About 2 billion they get from the West, and about 20 million gets produced domestically. Of that 20 billion cubic meters, they could realistically expand that by some 30% and perhaps more through investment in new technology. They're using the same technology that they used during the Soviet period in the 1970s, and I'm sure that these two gentlemen sitting at the end there have great ideas of what they could potentially do by engaging in the Ukrainian market. They have the ability to produce shale gas. Last year, Ukraine signed contracts with Chevron, Shell, Eni, for shale gas developments, and over a 10-year period, or by 2020, realistically, that could be expanded by 15 to 20 billion cubic meters. Ukraine has had huge subsidies in gas. In the past, it constituted about $13 billion a year, 7% of GDP. And so they have already started on May 1st, the beginning of phasing out of those gas subsidies, which will create an incentive for energy efficiency. And if you bring those factors together, it presents a situation where by 2020 or soon afterwards, Ukraine could be in a position between more production and efficiency to have choices about whether it imports Russian gas or not. Now, in the short term, the answer then becomes, what can Ukraine do to create some of its options? And so one of the things that the United States, the European community, Ukraine's neighbors have been working on are what are called so-called reverse flows. The ability to use this European gas market that now allows gas to be traded north to south, east to west, west to east, to be able to move gas so-called backwards back into Ukraine. So there's already about 1.5 billion cubic meters of gas capacity in Poland. It's small, but that has already begun. In Hungary, the potential is as high as 6.1 billion cubic meters a year. And those negotiations are on track, and potentially we'll see some results of that soon. On April 28th, Ukraine and Slovakia signed an agreement that will create a physical capacity to begin importing 3.2 billion cubic meters a year, expandable to between 8 and 10. So if those mechanisms are put in place, what it will begin to do is give Ukraine the ability to have some diversification of supply so that it's not just dependent on supplies from the east. The other key factor is to recognize that Ukraine is going to have to buy gas from Russia. It absolutely needs to do that at some level. And so the critical challenge is to put that trade in gas on market commercial terms. And this is where it's so crucial that the European Union is playing a role. And what the EU has done is to try to create a competitive gas market in Europe. And in that market, there's certain characteristics. The market defines prices. The market establishes that those who purchase the gas have the right to trade it. And the market also requires that those who consume the gas actually pay their bills. And so there you have the foundations for a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine on price, on trade, on payment of bills that provides a degree of transparency that could give this a potential resolution. Final thing I just want to say on this is the importance of Europe's active engagement. And I know that many European countries are concerned about this because there is a huge dependency on imported gas from Russia. But look at it from this perspective. Today, Russia is invested in 220 billion cubic meters of pipeline capacity to Europe. 220 billion cubic meters, supplying somewhere in the range of 150 to 160, including all countries, and not just the European Union. Russia has 14 billion cubic meters of export capacity to Asia. If Russia does not sell gas to Europe, it is decimating its own gas industry. And so this is the moment of opportunity to do exactly what Lord Mattingly has said, is to create the options for diversification of supply. There is no doubt that in 10 years, Russia is going to have pipelines to China. There's no doubt that they will have greater export LNG capacity because Asia is the fastest growing gas market in the world. Europe has this opportunity to use this moment in a way that advances its own diversification, but puts this in a realistic perspective, that now is the time when they can use that market power of 400 million consumers to be able to clearly define and insist on the rules of the marketplace in price and in competition, and ensuring that those rules are extended to Ukraine as well as part of the European energy community.
Just a very quick follow-up, and then I want to ask Ed and Dan to come in on this. The U.S. recently announced sanctions against some specific people and entities, including Igor Sechin, the head of Gazprom. Can you talk about where sanctions policy could go to address the concerns with Russia's actions now, and how they might be used in the energy sector, or how limited the ability to use them is given what a major supplier of oil and gas Russia is? Does that constrain the ability to use sanctions as a tool?
Look, the purpose of sanctions is to draw a red line on Russian behavior. Russia has obviously invaded the territorial integrity of Ukraine and Crimea, and perhaps just as disconcerting is the role that Russian security forces have been playing in the eastern parts of Ukraine, where the objective has not necessarily been intervention or control, but disruption. And as we've seen over time, it's a lot easier to disrupt with a few people, creating chaos and taking buildings and finding local groups to transfer them to them, than to create a clear and defined course for the future. And so the message that we, the United States and Europe, have been trying to send with sanctions is that continuing this behavior is going to have a cost, and that those sanctions will continue to be ratcheted up unless we move back to an example of conduct in the international community which is transparent and inconsistent with international law. There have been many comments about what might happen in the energy sector, and the President has held open the prospect of energy sector sanctions. When we talk about this, it's not in the context of the way that we saw sanctions against Iran, where what we were trying to do is cut off the exports of Iranian exports into the international community. Russia is a critical supplier of oil and gas. We want to see it to continue to supply that oil and gas on market competitive terms. We want to see Russia and Europe recognize the mutual interest they have in continuing transparent market relations. But what energy is important for as well is maintaining the confidence of capital markets in Russia's economy. Russia depends on hydrocarbon exports for 70% of its export revenue, for 52% of its budget revenue. And so to the extent to which there are signals that are sent that affect the confidence of Russia's hydrocarbons industry to be able to continue to grow, that is not a signal just about the Russian energy sector. It's about the ability of Russian capital markets and the interest of international capital markets to continue to finance Russia and the cost that they're going to pay for that debt. And so that is the critical point, I think, Jason, that we come back to in the energy sanctions. I'm not going to speculate what they would be. The United States and Europe have an interest in coordinating those steps together. We have had significant discussions on how to be able to move them forward. What we have made very clear is that if there isn't a change in behavior that demonstrates a willingness to abide by transparency and adherence to international law, then there will be a cost. And the cost is not so much in energy per se. The cost is going to be in the impact that this will have on capital markets and their willingness to finance Russia.
So I want to ask Ed and Dan to come in on this. I'll just, for people's situational awareness, say John Podesta's plane delay set us back slightly, so we're going to go about 10 to 15 minutes over, and apologies for that, but this is too good a group to sort of cut off this soon. Ed, can you comment? There's a lot of things here to talk about, but take any piece of it you want, but in particular thinking about the security of supply, the energy security, and what can be done in terms of policy to help Europe and to address concerns with Russian behavior.
I think I'd rather not comment further. I think we've covered much of that territory. I'm happy to comment on some other.
Well, there's another question specifically for you, which is on a different topic, which is about the remarkable stability we've seen in the crude oil price for the last 3 years. And the question targeted for you is, what killed crude volatility and what will cause it to come back?
Yeah, well, volatility was not just killed in the crude oil market, it was killed across all asset classes. So it's a much bigger puzzle. I think on the oil market side, the geopolitical puzzle is the following. It's not just the sudden, unexpected emergence of the Russian supply that's come into the marketplace, but we have since February 2011 seen a remarkable growth of disruption to supply in the market. Before the first Libyan disruption, there was less than 500,000 barrels a day of oil not in the marketplace. Since the Libyan disruption, that number has grown. And if you add the non-OPEC supply, the OPEC supply that is off market, and add to that the amount of Iranian crude that's not in the market, we're at like 3.5 million barrels a day of oil that was expected to be in the market that's not in the market. This is something that's clearly going to be with us for a long time because it in many ways represents, the Iranian sanctions aside, the failure of the petrostate to deliver in governance. And I think we will see the same forces that have brought about civil disorder in many oil-producing countries continue to do so and maybe ratchet up a bit. The really remarkable phenomenon is the market's non-reaction. It's not just the oil market's non-reaction, but financial markets have not reacted to Ukraine. They've not reacted to oil disruption, and oil prices have actually been increasingly stable over time since the February 2011 Libyan disruption. Not only stable in terms of the average price of Brent, and of course what's happening in our markets is another issue, but the trading range has narrowed from 88, 89 to 120 to something on the order of 103 to 112 for Brent. So it's a remarkable puzzle, and the question is whether the new supply coming in from Canada, the US, and increasingly from other places will be the balancing factor in the market that will allow the world to undergo a record amount of disruption in traditional flows, which is a record not only in the volume, but a record in terms of the dispersion of the disruption to as many countries as we've seen, with more potentially on the horizon.
Dan, can I ask you to respond to?
Well, yeah, I wanted to do that, but I thought first, if you don't mind, I will like to come back and answer, but Lord Mandelson was the Trade Commissioner of the EU, and I'd love to hear from him about sanctions and your view of the use of sanctions now and the situation and the efficacy. And then I'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not in office, and so I have the luxury of commenting on this from this stage rather than from within the government. But my view is that sanctions are necessary, inevitable, that they will, if Russia continues to introduce further instability into Ukraine, need to go to a third stage. I think in those circumstances the sanctions will target state-related Russian companies rather than individuals, and I think that however loath they are to see this further stage being reached, I think that key European nations are sort of girding themselves for this possibility. I can't judge what's going on in Mr. Putin's head. I heard what he had to say yesterday, and I think we have to treat what he says with a degree of skepticism. I don't mean rejection or hostility, I mean literally skepticism. We have to question how sincere he is in what he says, and we have to see real events, real people on the ground reflecting what he is saying before we can draw the conclusion that he is actually seeking to de-escalate this situation. Second point I would make is this. People in Europe will be very strongly opposed to energy being used as an instrument or a trigger to escalate our counteraction against what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine. And therefore we would want to see financial services, capital markets and flows targeted as a way of sanctioning Russia rather than sort of mounting any sort of sanction or embargo or blockade against Russian energy. I don't need to explain why that is the case, given the dependency of Europe generally on Russian sources, and given the position of Germany and Italy in particular as Russia's largest customers, the possibility of either of those two countries or others agreeing to using sort of energy as a lever in this, well, just don't hold your breath for it. Last point I'd make is this. In its energy relationship with Russia, you know, Europe is not heading for divorce. I mean, the relationship is too big for that, and it will continue to be big, and it creates a source of dependence, mutual dependence, between Europe and Russia for anyone to contemplate divorce, even in the medium term. On the other hand, Europe is going to become far, far less monogamous in that relationship it has with Russia. The emphasis on creating greater energy resilience. Already we are far more resilient in Europe than we were when the last interruption of supply occurred in 2009, not least because of the expansion of gas storage and because of the investment in interconnectors. And that has got to grow. But above all, we've got to look to those choices and alternatives, taking advantage of changes in the global marketplace over time to reduce our dependence on Russian gas. Last point I'd make also is this. Russia has as much to lose from playing about with energy supply, even to Ukraine, let alone the rest of Europe, as we have as a cost in playing around with our supply. If Russia moves and interrupts supply, even to Ukraine, that will send a massive signal to the rest of Europe, but it will also send a massive signal to the East, to Asia. And if they want to adjust their market mix and look more to the East and to Asia to find outlets for their energy, then they better step back from breaching that trust as a supplier, because what everyone will see in the future is one heck of a big need not themselves to become reliant on Russia as a supplier in the future, if this is the sort of action that they're prepared to take, even in relation to Ukraine, let alone, as I say, the rest of Europe.
Dan, you should pick up any piece of that you want. There's a lot there, but I'm particularly interested also in your thoughts. We're talking a lot about energy security and what that phrase means to you, and how in the US, where we talk a lot about we're not importing gas anymore, we're importing much less oil, what does it mean to be more energy secure for our country?
Right. Well, let me, if I can, respond to some of these points too. A lot of wisdom has just been spoken, but it's striking that we are sort of a little bit back in a sort of Cold War. A lot of effort went into trying to assess what are the intentions of the Kremlin. That kind of went out of fashion, and yet here we are again. What are the intentions of the Kremlin? Was this an impulsive response to the sense that Ukraine was going to move into the Western sphere and no longer be part of this Russian sphere of privileged interest? Was it the fact that, as President Putin has said, 2007, Ukraine's not a country, or was this a long strategy and so forth, and what kind of game is it being invented as it goes along or not? And I'm sure Carlos has some views of that. But the point that Peter made about Russia has spent 5 decades trying to establish that it is a reliable supplier to Europe, except a few countries to the east, and that in fact, just recently, the number 2 at Gazprom said natural gas is not a weapon, it's a commodity in that point. And exactly, and now that Mr. Putin in 2 weeks will be in Beijing talking about a gas deal with the Chinese, and the point that Peter made is something that will be actually hanging over that. I think when we talk about sanctions, there has to be coordination with the Europeans, and they will have somewhat different perspectives on it because of a different kind of engagement. I think there's also always the question with sanctions of unintended consequences. You hear about, sort of garden variety financial institutions who now find that they have a problem in because they have loans that they need to make some changes in. Are they violating sanctions? And we don't want sanctions that will hurt the countries of Eastern Europe. So getting them right is quite a challenge. But I think that maybe the real impact of this, and what explains what happened yesterday in Mr. Putin's statements, we don't know. Maybe it was just saying this thing is getting out of control and there can be unintended consequences. But one effect is those who were at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last June will remember the big theme is that Russia needs foreign investment because its growth rate has plummeted from about 7% to about 1% or maybe 0%. Well, one thing that's probably, as a result of this, sanctions or no sanctions, that most every company, at least thinking for the future, when they go to their board to talk about what are they going to do in Russia, many of them will look at the calculations differently than they might have a year ago. And that's a very important issue when part of the deal that the Kremlin has with the Russian people is we will deliver a higher standard of living to you rather than no growth. And I think to kind of wind up, Carlos talked about a deal on gas between Russia and Ukraine, and that points to the larger thing, that either there's some kind of negotiated settlement, there's some kind of agreement about going forward, maybe one that will not be very clear about a federal or still a unitary state of Ukraine, but some way to resolve this, because the alternative for everybody is a bad situation. This wouldn't be like Transnistria, or this wouldn't be like Abkhazia, sort of a gray zone. This would be a big sore in Europe, and so maybe that's what's going to begin, and we'll see how well these elections go on. So that's a long preamble to the question of what does energy security mean. I think it means a lot of different things. But it means being able to deal with emergencies, it means resilience, and it means ensuring that the investment is being made, that you have the type of energy resources and capabilities that you need in the future. And I think it also goes to very much what Dan Poneman was talking about, having the information, high-quality information, to, among other things, avoid panic. So that's why it's really important that you were at that gas station in Queens.
I wish we had much more time to talk about lots of other places in the world, particularly China in light of this week's developments in the South China Seas and other things. I want to close just by taking one question via social media from Student Energy, which is, what is the one market or geopolitical trend that students should pay attention to when developing their future career plans? Can we start with you, Ed, or are you thinking?
Professor Morse.
Yeah, I think disruptive technology is the place to look. I think we've seen disruptive technology at work in being able to get this unconventional revolution going. We see disruptive technologies at work in power generating system. I think follow the technological line, and we'll see disruptive forces. And when there are disruptive forces, there are always winners and losers, and that's what geopolitics is all about.
Any thoughts?
I bow to your superior wisdom. It seems to me that looking to technological disruption is fine, but the use of the word disruption brings home to us all, I hope, that whatever virtues and advantages the United States now has in its energy revolution, the world continues to be a very interdependent place. The global economy continues to be very integrated, and therefore isolationism, in whatever form or manifestation it takes, is not, in my view, an attractive consequence of greater energy self-sufficiency in the United States. The United States, I'm afraid, remains the world's indispensable nation, and that means there will be very firm limits on how much you can disengage and withdraw from the rest of the world.
Carlos, advice for students?
Huge wisdom in Ed's point, and I would just, rather than say disruptive technology, I would say transformative technology, and the intersection of those transformative technologies with markets, with capital markets, with entrepreneurship. You know, if you think about the United States, in 2005, shale gas was 1% of U.S. production. Today, it's 35% of U.S. gas production. That's an example of how the technology, the resource, and the markets actually combine. The other thing that I would say, just looking ahead over the next decade, is the transformative nature of natural gas markets and the phenomenal way that they are changing. The advent of LNG, and Sharif is, at the center of that, is having a massive impact on those markets. But the geopolitical implications of this, of creating competition and trade, the way it affects major suppliers, the way it impacts consumers, is huge in magnitude in politics and economics and in technology. And it's a fascinating area in which to engage.
Closing word of advice?
So I thought I could extract a one-sentence summary from the quest and a one-sentence summary from the prize. I think the quest is what Ed pointed to and has been modified. Disruption, you can just think, it does seem every we all sort of think we know where the world's going, and every 3, 4, 5 years ago, something comes along, a financial crisis, a Fukushima, shale gas, upheaval in the Arab world, etc., and you kind of move into a different reality. So I think disruption and surprise is one lesson. The other, in the prize, as I sometimes look back at that book, it has hundreds and hundreds of very interesting characters, but the two most important characters in that book are, I believe, supply and demand. So I think that the other thing that is very important is actually seeking to understand how these energy markets work and how they're changing.
Great. I think everyone is familiar with those, but sometimes people are new and learning about energy, or students are new to the field, and so the quest and the prize for which Dan won the Pulitzer Prize, and the quest, more recent book, both of which are absolute must-reads to understand the history of U.S. energy and what's happening in the U.S. energy space now, which are certainly assigned in my course, and I know lots of other people's as well. So I appreciate your indulgence going a few minutes over. I really appreciate our panelists' time being with us today, and for some, like Lord Mandelson, traveling from far to be here. I hope you've enjoyed this and learned as much from it as I have, and we will be back next spring with another annual forum, as well as many, many programs and conferences and speakers and lecturers in between, as well as research coming out of the center. So I'd invite everyone now to not only give everyone here a round of applause, but also then to join us for a reception in the faculty room, which is directly behind the stage. Thank you.